Her name is synonymous with evil. But how much do you really know about Jezebel, the queen who openly defied God, brought foreign gods into Israel, and hunted down his prophets? Her story is one of the most shocking in all of Scripture, a tale of power, manipulation, and ultimate divine judgment. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what she did, but why her legacy has endured for thousands of years as a warning about the dangers of abandoning faith for power. But before we begin, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The blood in the dust. The sun sets over ancient Jezreel. Dust settles in the narrow streets as shadows grow long. A royal chariot arrives at the palace gates. The rider, Jehu, a military commander with fire in his eyes, has come with purpose. His men surround him, weapons glinting in the fading light. Above, at a high window, stands a woman. Her eyes are ringed with kohl, her face painted carefully. Her jewelry catches the last rays of sunlight. She is not hiding. She is not fleeing. She stands tall, defiant to the end. "Is it peace, Jehu?" calls down a voice from the palace. But peace is not what he brings today. "Throw her down," Jehu commands, looking up at the painted queen. The eunuchs beside her hesitate only a moment. Their loyalty breaks. Hands push against royal robes. A scream cuts through the evening air. Then comes the sickening sound of flesh meeting stone. The horse's hooves crush what remains. Jehu enters the palace to feast, to celebrate his victory. Later, when men go to bury her, for she was a king's daughter after all, they find almost nothing. Just a skull, hands, feet, nothing more. The rest taken by the wild dogs that roam the city. "This is the word of the Lord," Jehu says, which he spoke through Elijah the Tishbite. "On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh." And so ends the life of one of history's most notorious queens. A woman whose name would become synonymous with wickedness, seduction, and defiance. A foreign princess who brought her gods to Israel. A queen who challenged prophets and orchestrated murder. A ruler whose painted face at the window remains one of the Bible's most haunting images. But who was Jezebel, really? Was she truly the villain her enemies claimed? What shaped this woman who dared to stand against a god not her own? To understand Jezebel, we must first understand the world that created her. A world of competing kingdoms, ancient gods, and the ever-shifting sands of power in the ancient Near East. Her story is one of cultural clash, religious fervor, and raw political ambition. It's a tale of a woman who refused to bend, even when faced with prophets who commanded fire from heaven. It's about power, who wields it, who seeks it, and what people will do to keep it. In the quiet aftermath of her violent death, with dogs licking blood from the stones of Jezreel, a question hangs in the air. How did a princess of Tyre become the most hated woman in Scripture? What turned a royal daughter into the queen who defied God? To answer this, we must journey back, before the blood, before the prophets, before the name Jezebel brought fear to the hearts of the faithful. We must travel to a time when Israel was young and fragile, when mighty empires surrounded the promised land, and when the stage was being set for one of the Bible's most dramatic confrontations. The dust settles. The dogs retreat to the shadows. But Jezebel's story is far from over. Though her flesh is gone, her tale endures. A warning to some, a fascination to others, and a reminder of what happens when human will collides with divine purpose. Before Jezebel. Long before Jezebel drew breath, the lands that would shape her destiny were already ancient. Israel, not yet a unified kingdom, existed as a collection of tribal territories, loosely bound by shared ancestry and faith in Yahweh. To the north lay Phoenicia, a sophisticated maritime civilization with thriving cities like Tyre and Sidon stretching along the Mediterranean coast. These were lands of stark contrast. Israel, still finding its footing after generations of wandering, was primarily inland, agricultural, and tribal. The people lived close to the soil, following seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest. Their God was invisible, speaking through prophets and judges rather than through idols or temples. Phoenicia, meanwhile, gleamed with wealth from sea trade. Their ships, crafted from the famous cedars of Lebanon, traveled to distant shores, returning laden with gold, silver, ivory, and exotic goods. Their cities boasted impressive temples where gods and goddesses were worshipped with elaborate rituals. Chief among these deities were Baal, the storm god who brought rainfall, and Asherah, goddess of fertility. The Israelites had only recently established a monarchy. After the turbulent period of the judges, the people had demanded a king like all the other nations. First came Saul, troubled and ultimately rejected. Then David, the shepherd king who united the tribes and conquered Jerusalem. His son Solomon expanded the kingdom further, building the first temple and establishing diplomatic ties with surrounding powers. But Solomon's death brought crisis. The kingdom split in two: Israel in the north with its capital at Samaria, and Judah in the south centered on Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, where our story unfolds, immediately faced problems of legitimacy. Its first king, Jeroboam, feared losing power if his people continued traveling to Jerusalem to worship, so he established alternate worship sites with golden calves at Dan and Bethel. From its beginning, the northern kingdom struggled with questions of proper worship. This religious instability would later create the perfect environment for Jezebel's influence. While Israel's politics shifted like sand, prophetic movements grew in importance. Unlike the temple priests with their ordained rituals, prophets claimed direct communication with Yahweh. They emerged unexpectedly from all walks of life. Some were educated, others simple farmers or shepherds. What united them was their bold claim, "Thus says the Lord." These prophets served as Israel's conscience, challenging kings who strayed from Yahweh's commands. They stood outside the power structures, unafraid to deliver uncomfortable messages. Kings might command armies, but prophets commanded words that could shake kingdoms. In the hill country, small farming communities preserved older, simpler forms of faith. These rural believers often clashed with the more cosmopolitan attitudes developing in cities like Samaria. They viewed foreign alliances with suspicion, seeing them as threats to Israel's unique identity and covenant relationship with Yahweh. This was the landscape into which Jezebel would eventually arrive: a divided kingdom, religious tensions, prophetic movements gaining strength, and a constant push-pull between isolation and engagement with foreign cultures. The stage was set for conflict. Israel's kings sought political stability through alliances, while prophets demanded religious purity. The rural population clung to traditional ways, while urban centers embraced new ideas and practices. Ancient tribal loyalties competed with newer political structures. In this uncertain world, leadership constantly changed hands. The northern kingdom saw dynasty after dynasty rise and fall through assassination and coup. Without the stabilizing influence of David's lineage that anchored Judah, Israel's throne was a dangerous prize, frequently claimed through bloodshed. This was the inheritance awaiting the yet unborn Jezebel, a land of opportunity and danger where a foreign princess might find herself wielding unexpected power and where the clash of gods and cultures would soon erupt into open conflict. Tyre and the daughters of Baal. Tyre rose from the Mediterranean like a dream carved from stone and cedar. Part of the city stood on the mainland, but its heart beat on an island fortress just offshore, nearly impregnable, surrounded by waters that shifted from turquoise to deep sapphire. Here, in one of the ancient world's greatest maritime powers, Jezebel was born a princess of the royal house. Phoenicians were not what they called themselves. That name came from the Greeks, referring to the purple dye they famously produced. They were Canaanites who called their land simply the coast. Their true genius lay in trade rather than conquest. While other empires expanded through warfare, Tyre built its power through commerce and craftsmanship. Phoenician ships were the envy of the Mediterranean world. Their sailors navigated by stars to reach distant shores, Spain, North Africa, perhaps even Britain, returning with silver, gold, ivory, and exotic goods that flowed into Tyre's bustling harbors. The city's markets overflowed with treasures. Delicate glasswork, intricately carved ivory, and textiles dyed the famous Tyrian purple, so expensive that its wear became restricted to royalty. In this world of wealth and sophistication, religion was central to daily life. Towering over the city stood the temples of Melkart, the city's patron deity, Baal-Shamem, Lord of the Heavens, and Astarte, Queen of Heaven. Unlike Yahweh worship with its prohibition of images, Phoenician religion embraced the visual and sensory. Golden statues caught the sunlight, incense perfumed the air, and music filled sacred spaces. Baal, the storm god who brought life-giving rain, held special importance in this maritime culture. His consort Asherah, represented by sacred poles or trees, embodied fertility and nature's abundance. Their worship included seasonal festivals marking agricultural cycles, celebrations that could become quite exuberant, even sensual by Israelite standards. Temple complexes included not just shrines, but administrative centers. Priests weren't merely religious figures, but political powers who managed vast temple estates. Sacred prostitution, a practice horrifying to Israelite prophets, formed part of fertility rituals honoring Astarte. The line between religious devotion and state function blurred in ways that would later influence Jezebel's approach to power. Phoenician princesses received education unusual for women of their era. They learned multiple languages for diplomatic purposes. They studied history, literature, and the complex religious rituals they would need to maintain in foreign courts. A royal daughter like Jezebel would have been trained from childhood in the art of wielding soft power, influence rather than direct authority. These daughters of Tyre were valuable diplomatic assets. Marriage alliances secured trade routes, stabilized borders, and created military partnerships. When a Phoenician princess traveled to a foreign court, she brought not just her dowry, but cultural connections that benefited her homeland. She remained her father's daughter even while becoming another man's wife. The palace where Jezebel grew up buzzed with international visitors, Egyptian officials in their white linen, Assyrian ambassadors with their carefully curled beards, merchants distant islands speaking strange tongues. She would have observed her father, King Ethbal, whose name ironically means with Baal, navigating these diplomatic waters, building alliances while maintaining Tyre's independence. Ethbal himself had risen to power through unconventional means. Ancient sources suggest he was originally a priest of Astarte who seized the throne. This blending of religious and political authority would have shaped Jezebel's understanding of power from her earliest days. She grew up seeing no contradiction between serving the gods and wielding worldly influence. As a princess of Tyre, Jezebel's religious identity was inseparable from her political role. The gods blessed and legitimized royal authority. In return, royalty ensured proper worship through temple building and ritual observance. The idea that religion could be separated from statecraft would have seemed nonsensical to her. All these influences, commercial wealth, religious devotion, diplomatic skill, cultural sophistication, shaped the woman who would one day arrive in Israel. She was a product of one of the ancient world's most cosmopolitan societies, raised to view international connections as strength rather than compromise. And she carried within her the absolute certainty that Baal's storms brought life, that Asherah's fertility ensured prosperity, and that honoring these deities was both a royal duty and a kingdom salvation. This worldview, so natural to a daughter of Tyre, would soon collide with the fierce monotheism taking root in Israel, with consequences neither kingdom could have foreseen. The making of a princess. Within the palace walls of Tyre, young Jezebel woke each morning to the sounds of the sea. Waves crashed against the island city's foundations, a constant reminder of both protection and possibility. Her chambers, likely overlooking the harbor, offered views of trading vessels coming and going, their sails bright against the Mediterranean blue. Her daily life followed patterns established for royal daughters across generations. Mornings began with attendants dressing her in fine linen garments dyed with the famous purple that symbolized her status. Gold jewelry, perhaps decorated with lotus flowers or protective symbols, adorned her wrists and throat. Cosmetics enhanced her features, a skill she would maintain throughout her life, evident even in her final moments. Education for a princess of Tyre went far beyond what most women of her era received. Tutors taught her to read and write, likely in several languages. Phoenicians had developed an alphabet of just 22 letters that revolutionized writing systems across the Mediterranean. This innovation made literacy more accessible, though still primarily reserved for elites. Jezebel's religious training would have been especially thorough. As a royal daughter, she might someday represent Tyre's faith in a foreign court. She learned intricate ritual procedures, the proper timing of festivals, and the attributes of various deities. She memorized prayers, practiced ceremonial movements, and absorbed theological concepts that explained how the gods interacted with human affairs. Music likely filled her days. The sound of lyres, drums, and cymbals accompanying religious ceremonies and palace entertainments. She may have been trained in sacred dances that honored Astarte, movements that celebrated feminine power and fertility. These religious expressions, so natural to her, would later appear shockingly foreign to Israelite observers. The palace served as a political classroom. From behind curtains or screens, she observed her father receiving foreign dignitaries, negotiating treaties, and managing the complex web of relationships that kept Tyre prosperous. She watched how he balanced firmness with flexibility, when to press an advantage and when to compromise. King Ethbal himself presents a fascinating figure. Classical sources name him as a priest of Astarte who took the throne, possibly through violence. This origin story suggests Jezebel grew up with a father who embodied both religious and political authority, a model she would later attempt to replicate in Israel. His name, with Baal, proclaimed divine backing for his rule. Tyre's palace complex housed more than just the royal family. Courtiers, officials, priests, servants, and guards created a bustling small city within the city. Young Jezebel navigated this world of competing interests and shifting alliances, learning early that power resided not just in official positions, but in relationships, information, and perception. Meals in the palace showcased Phoenician wealth and sophistication. Seafood fresh from the Mediterranean, fruits and vegetables from fertile coastal plains, wines imported from across the known world, all served on finely crafted dishes of silver or delicate pottery. Dining wasn't merely sustenance, but a display of status and an opportunity for political discussion. From the women's quarters, Jezebel absorbed practical wisdom from her mother, aunts, and female courtiers. They taught her how to manage a royal household, the importance of producing heirs, and subtle ways women could influence decisions in male-dominated power structures. She learned that a queen's authority often operated through indirect channels: advice given in private moments, strategic alliances with court officials, careful management of access to the king. Religious festivals punctuated the year with color and excitement. During Baal's autumn ceremonies, the palace and city celebrated the coming of seasonal rains vital for agriculture. Spring rites honored Astarte with expressions of fertility and renewal. These celebrations, with their music, feasting, and sometimes sensual elements, created Jezebel's understanding of proper worship, dramatically different from Yahweh's austere rituals. As she matured, Jezebel would have understood her likely destiny, marriage to a foreign ruler to secure political alliance. Phoenician royal women were raised with this expectation. They served as living treaties, physical embodiments of agreements between kingdoms. Their marriages created blood bonds between royal houses and opened trade routes that enriched both nations. What set Jezebel apart, perhaps, was the intensity of her religious devotion. Later events suggest she wasn't merely a nominal follower of Baal and Asherah, but a true believer, committed to spreading their worship. Whether this zeal developed in childhood or emerged later remains speculative, but her actions in Israel reveal a woman unwilling to abandon her gods, even when politically expedient. As she grew into young womanhood, Jezebel likely participated in more state functions, becoming visible to foreign emissaries visiting Tyre. Her beauty, intelligence, and royal bearing would have made her a valuable diplomatic asset. And somewhere in these interactions, representatives from a divided kingdom to the south, Israel, took notice of this princess who might bring Phoenician wealth and naval power into alliance with their nation. Israel without a queen. Israel's northern kingdom quivered with instability. Unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, secure under David's lineage, the north suffered constant upheaval. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed, many through violence rather than natural succession. The land needed not just a ruler, but a stabilizing force, perhaps a queen who might bring both international connection and domestic continuity. After Solomon's death and the kingdom's division, Israel's troubles began immediately. Jeroboam, its first king, feared losing his people's loyalty if they continued worshiping at Jerusalem's temple. His solution proved fateful. He established competing worship sites at Dan and Bethel, complete with golden calves. "Here are your gods, O Israel," he proclaimed, echoing words from Israel's wilderness rebellion centuries earlier. This religious compromise set a pattern. Northern kings repeatedly chose political expediency over religious purity. The prophets called it evil, but from a pragmatic standpoint, these kings were solving real problems: how to govern a breakaway kingdom while building distinct national identity. Violence marked the transfers of power. Jeroboam's son Nadab ruled just 2 years before being assassinated by Baasha, who then exterminated the entire royal family. Baasha's own son Elah met a similar fate, murdered while drunk by his chariot commander Zimri, who then eliminated all male relatives of the previous dynasty. Zimri himself enjoyed only 7 days on the throne. When news of his coup reached Israel's army, they immediately declared their general Omri as king instead. Zimri, cornered in the palace at Tirzah, set fire to the building and perished in the flames rather than face capture. Civil war followed as another claimant, Tibni, gathered supporters against Omri. For 4 years, the land suffered divided loyalties until Omri finally prevailed. This constant bloodshed created a kingdom where trust was scarce and security scarcer. Royal children grew up knowing they might be slaughtered for their bloodline. Court officials watched for shifting winds of power. Common people suffered under distracted, insecure leadership. Against this turbulent backdrop emerged Omri, a military commander whose skill lay in practical solutions rather than religious devotion. Though the Bible describes him tersely as doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, secular records reveal his substantial accomplishments. He established a new capital at Samaria, strategically located on a defensible hill with commanding views of surrounding territory. The site he chose had natural springs, crucial during siege warfare. Omri achieved what his predecessors couldn't: enough stability to found a dynasty. Under his leadership, Israel gained international recognition. Assyrian records refer to Israel as the House of Omri long after his death, suggesting his impact on regional politics. He secured his borders through military strength and diplomatic marriages, establishing ties with neighboring Judah through the marriage of his son Ahab to Judean princess Athaliah. As Omri grew older, his son Ahab increasingly participated in governance, preparing to inherit the hard-won stability. But one piece remained missing in their political strategy: a strong northern alliance to balance their southern connection with Judah. Phoenicia, with its maritime power and commercial wealth, offered the perfect counterweight. While politically shrewd, these arrangements created religious complications. Marriage alliances typically required respecting the bride's original faith. Royal women brought not just dowries, but priests, religious items, and expectations of continued worship. This custom, standard in international relations of the period, would directly challenge Israel's commitment to Yahweh alone. The prophetic movement gained strength during these unstable years. Prophets emerged as countercultural voices, challenging royal authority when it deviated from covenant faithfulness. Unlike court prophets who told kings what they wanted to hear, these independent figures spoke uncomfortable truths, often at personal risk. Rural Israelites, particularly in the northern hill country, maintained stricter adherence to traditional Yahweh worship. They viewed the religious compromises of their kings with alarm. These tensions between urban pragmatism and rural traditionalism, between political necessity and religious purity, created fault lines throughout society. The absence of a strong queen figure during this period is notable. Kings had wives, certainly, but historical records mention no woman who significantly shaped northern kingdom politics before Jezebel. Her arrival would fill this vacuum with unprecedented force, bringing feminine power into a landscape dominated by male violence. By the time Ahab prepared to take his father's throne, Israel desperately needed stability. The kingdom had weathered decades of assassination, civil war, and religious division. Omri had begun the healing process through military strength and political savvy. Now his son would attempt to continue this work by reaching north to Phoenicia, seeking alliance with the sophisticated trading power whose princess might bring both international prestige and commercial advantage to Israel. Neither father nor son could have foreseen how this political calculation would transform Israel's religious landscape. The princess they sought was no passive diplomatic token, but a woman of fierce conviction and unstoppable will. Jezebel of Tyre, devoted follower of Baal and Asherah, soon to become the most controversial queen in Israel's history. A deal is struck. In the opulent throne room of Tyre, two kings met to reshape the political landscape. Ethbal of Phoenicia and Omri of Israel, both pragmatic rulers who had seized their thrones through unconventional means, recognized potential advantages in alliance. Their discussions, likely extending over months through intermediaries before any face-to-face meeting, centered on mutual benefit rather than shared values. Phoenicia offered what Israel desperately needed: international legitimacy, trade connections, and access to luxury goods that could elevate the Northern Kingdom's standing. Israel, in turn, provided Phoenicia with an inland buffer against potential enemies and secured trade routes to Jerusalem and beyond. The proposed marriage alliance between Tyre's Princess Jezebel and Israel's Crown Prince Ahab would cement these advantages in flesh and blood. Marriage contracts in the ancient Near East functioned as international treaties. The documents specified not just dowry amounts, but religious accommodations, trade agreements, and military commitments. Ethbal would have insisted on provisions allowing his daughter to continue worshiping her gods. Omri, focused on political advantage rather than religious purity, likely saw this as a minor concession for major gain. For Jezebel herself, the moment of agreement brought mixed emotions. Marriage to a foreign prince meant permanent separation from her homeland. Though raised expecting such a fate, the reality would have been sobering. Yet, diplomatic marriages also offered unusual opportunities for female influence. As her father's representative in a foreign court, she carried authority beyond typical queenly roles. Preparations began immediately. Her dowry, likely including gold, silver, fine textiles, and perhaps Phoenician craftsmen, was assembled. Priests of Baal and Asherah were selected to accompany her, maintaining proper worship in her new home. Servants, handmaidens, and advisors were chosen to form her household in Israel. Each person represented a thread of connection back to Tyre, ensuring she wouldn't stand alone in a foreign land. The physical journey from Tyre to Samaria traced ancient trade routes, winding through coastal plains before turning inland toward the hills of Israel. The royal procession, with its guards, pack animals, and covered carriages, would have moved slowly, creating anticipation in every village it passed. For many common Israelites, this would be their first glimpse of Phoenician wealth and their introduction to the foreign princess, soon to become their queen. In Samaria, King Omri oversaw preparations for the bride's arrival. The still-developing capital needed suitable accommodations for a princess raised in cosmopolitan Tyre. Perhaps this motivated the ivory house mentioned in later biblical texts, a palace adorned with ivory carvings that archaeological excavations confirm existed in Samaria. Such luxury items, often decorated with Phoenician motifs, physically embodied the cultural exchange this marriage represented. News of the impending royal wedding spread throughout Israel with mixed reactions. Court officials saw opportunities for wealth and advancement through new Phoenician connections. Merchants anticipated expanded trade possibilities. But rural communities and those devoted to traditional Yahweh worship viewed these developments with alarm. A foreign queen meant foreign gods on Israelite soil. Prophets, particularly those outside the royal court system, raised early warnings. From their perspective, this marriage threatened the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel. The first commandment explicitly prohibited worshiping other gods, yet the diplomatic agreement guaranteed Jezebel's right to maintain her faith. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the very terms that created the alliance. When Ahab and Jezebel finally met, they encountered partners shaped by very different worlds. He was the son of a military commander, raised in a kingdom torn by civil war and assassination, where survival often trumped principle. She was a princess of sophisticated Tyre, educated in both religious and political affairs, accustomed to seeing divine and royal authority as naturally intertwined. Their wedding combined elements from both cultures, a diplomatic dance that honored two traditions while creating something new. Omri likely used the celebration to showcase his kingdom's growing prosperity under his leadership. For many Israelite nobles, this event provided their first taste of Phoenician luxury goods and cultural practices, exotic, enticing, and worryingly foreign. The political benefits manifested immediately. Israel gained standing among neighboring powers through connection with prestigious Tyre. Trade increased along secured routes between the kingdoms. Phoenician architectural and artistic influences began appearing in Samaria, creating a more cosmopolitan capital that reflected Omri's ambitions for his previously backwater kingdom. But beneath these material advantages, religious tensions simmered. The marriage contract's provisions allowing Jezebel to worship Baal and Asherah required physical space for this practice. Temples or shrines needed construction, ritual items needed housing, and priests needed accommodation. Each visible sign of these foreign religions deepened concern among traditionalists. Neither Omri nor Ethbal could have predicted how profoundly this marriage would shape Israel's future. What began as standard diplomatic practice, a princess married for alliance, maintaining her original faith, would evolve into something far more contentious. Jezebel, raised to see religious and political authority as inseparable, would not be content with private devotion in a side chapel. She brought with her not just her gods, but a missionary zeal that would transform and divide her adopted homeland. The deal struck between aging kings seeking practical advantages had unleashed forces neither fully understood. A new chapter in Israel's religious history began with the arrival of this foreign queen, not through conquest or coercion, but through the common diplomatic practice of marriage alliance. The storm that would follow remained, for now, just a distant cloud on the horizon. Arrival in Samaria. The procession wound its way up the final hill to Samaria. At its center, shielded from sun and dust by elaborate canopies, traveled Jezebel, no longer merely a princess of Tyre, but now bride to Israel's crown prince. The city rising before her must have seemed both impressive and provincial compared to her island homeland. Samaria stood as Omri's masterpiece, a capital built from scratch on a hill commanding the surrounding valleys. Its location combined natural defense with proximity to major trade routes. The construction remained ongoing, with workers laying stones for expanded fortifications even as the wedding procession approached. This was a city becoming something greater, much like the kingdom it represented. The crowds lining the approach revealed Israel's diversity. Court officials in their finest garments stood closest to the gates, ready with formal welcomes. Behind them gathered merchants hoping for Phoenician trade connections, artisans curious about foreign craftsmanship, and common people drawn by the spectacle. Further back, watching with guarded expressions, stood rural Israelites whose devotion to Yahweh made them suspicious of foreign influence. For Jezebel, this first exposure to her new people would have confirmed what diplomatic briefings had likely told her. Israel was a kingdom divided not just from Judah, but within itself. Religious tensions, tribal loyalties, and the still fresh wounds of civil war created a fragmented society. Where she might have seen opportunity for unifying influence, others saw threatening foreign intrusion. The formal welcome would have followed ancient protocols, ritualized speeches, symbolic gifts, carefully choreographed movements that acknowledged both her royal status and her new role as Ahab's wife. King Omri, aging but still commanding, likely led these ceremonies, establishing publicly that this marriage had his full support. Ahab himself remains something of a mystery in these early interactions. Biblical texts offer little insight into his feelings about his Phoenician bride. Political marriages rarely began with personal affection, but successful ones often developed genuine partnership over time. What's clear is that throughout their marriage, Ahab never restricted Jezebel's religious practices or political influence, suggesting either support for her activities or inability to control them. Jezebel's first days in Samaria involved navigating unfamiliar geography and even more unfamiliar social dynamics. The palace complex, while impressive by Israelite standards, likely disappointed a princess raised in Tyre's splendor. The local foods, clothing styles, and daily routines all required adjustment. Even the climate differed. Samaria's inland location meant hotter summers and cooler winters than coastal Tyre. Language presented another barrier. Though diplomatic education likely gave Jezebel knowledge of Hebrew, nuances and regional expressions would have escaped her initially. This linguistic disadvantage could be manipulated by court officials resistant to her influence, with conversations shifting to local idioms when sensitive topics arose. Establishing her religious practices created immediate challenges. The The marriage agreement guaranteed her right to worship her gods, but implementing this required physical space and resources. Where would Baal's temple stand? Who would fund the priest's maintenance? How would sacred festivals be celebrated? These practical questions carried profound theological implications in a land covenanted to Yahweh alone. The Israelite court ladies assigned to attend her represented another complexity. Some likely viewed their role as an honor, eager to learn Phoenician fashions and customs. Others may have been placed deliberately as informants, reporting her activities to various court factions. Jezebel needed to distinguish allies from adversaries while still new to every face around her. Rural prophets, those not dependent on court patronage, registered immediate protest. Though specific denunciations from this period aren't recorded in biblical texts, later prophetic attitudes suggest early resistance to her presence. These figures, often dressed simply and speaking with blunt directness, would have provided stark contrast to the polished Phoenician priests in Jezebel's entourage. Despite these challenges, Jezebel possessed significant advantages. Her education had prepared her for diplomatic complexity. She brought considerable wealth that could purchase loyalty and influence. Most importantly, she carried her father's authority as his daughter and representative, giving her status beyond merely being Ahab's wife. Gradually, she established her household within the larger palace structure. Phoenician decorative elements began appearing: furniture inlaid with ivory, wall hangings with distinctive motifs, the subtle introduction of her cultural aesthetic into Israelite spaces. These physical changes symbolized the more significant transformations her presence would bring. As Omri's health declined, Ahab increasingly handled daily governance, with Jezebel at his side. The transition following Omri's death proved smoother than previous royal successions, marking the first peaceful transfer of power in the Northern Kingdom's turbulent history. This stability, which had been Omri's primary goal in arranging the Phoenician alliance, seemed initially achieved. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, tensions continued building. Each visible sign of Baal worship, each altar constructed, each priest installed, each festival celebrated, deepened the divide between those embracing international connections and those committed to traditional Yahwism. Jezebel had arrived physically in Samaria, but the cultural and religious integration her presence represented remained deeply contentious. In these early days, before open conflict erupted, Jezebel likely believed she was simply fulfilling her role as a royal daughter and diplomatic wife. The practices that seemed natural to her, honoring her gods, promoting beneficial cultural exchange, strengthening her husband's court, appeared to others as dangerous foreign corruption. The stage was set for a clash not just between individuals, but between fundamentally different understandings of Israel's identity and purpose. Ahab, the puppet or the player? The man who shared Jezebel's bed and throne remains one of history's most ambiguous kings. Was Ahab a weak-willed husband dominated by his foreign wife, or a shrewd political player who used her influence to further his own agenda? The biblical narrative presents him primarily as a puppet dancing to Jezebel's strings, but archaeological evidence and careful reading suggest a more complex reality. Unlike his father Omri, who rose from military command to seize the throne, Ahab was born to royal expectations. He inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom, finally achieving stability after generations of violence. This inheritance shaped his priorities: maintaining the peace his father established, continuing diplomatic relationships that protected Israel's borders, and building the prosperity that legitimized his dynasty. Physically, we can only speculate about Ahab's appearance. No portraits survive, of course, but excavated Sumerian palaces suggest he surrounded himself with luxury. Ivory carvings, fine masonry, and elaborate buildings speak of a king who appreciated material splendor. Perhaps this aesthetic sensibility formed an early bond with his Phoenician bride, whose homeland excelled in such craftsmanship. The biblical account mentions Ahab's ivory house, not entirely made of ivory, of course, but decorated with ivory panels and furnishings. Archaeological discoveries confirm that ivory decorations, often with Phoenician motifs, adorned elite buildings in Samaria during this period. These luxury items represented not just wealth, but international connection, tangible symbols of Israel's growing cosmopolitanism under Omri and Ahab. As a military leader, Ahab showed genuine skill. Biblical and Assyrian records indicate he successfully defended Israel against powerful threats, particularly from Syria. At the Battle of Karkar, he contributed one of the largest chariot forces in a coalition of kings opposing Assyrian expansion. These achievements contradict the image of incompetence that his religious failings might suggest. In governance, Ahab demonstrated administrative ability. He continued his father's building projects, strengthening fortifications at strategic sites across the kingdom. Under his rule, Israel prospered economically, with archaeological evidence showing increased trade and material wealth. Whatever his religious shortcomings, he provided the security and prosperity citizens expected from their king. His relationship with Jezebel defies simple characterization. The Bible records no instance where Ahab directly opposed her will, suggesting either agreement with her actions or inability to control them. When she orchestrated Naboth's death to obtain his vineyard, Ahab accepted the ill-gotten land without protest. Yet, when Elijah confronted him, he displayed genuine remorse, tearing his clothes and fasting in an act of contrition that briefly stayed divine judgment. This pattern appears repeatedly. Ahab permits religious innovations that offend traditional Yahwism, benefits from Jezebel's bold actions while maintaining personal deniability, then shows regret when confronted by prophets. Is this the behavior of a manipulated husband or a calculating king who allows his foreign wife to take risks and absorb criticism for policies that ultimately serve his interests? The Bible describes their marriage in unusually strong terms. There was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife. This phrasing, urged on rather than forced or deceived, suggests partnership more than domination. It implies Ahab's willing participation in decisions that prophetic writers condemned. Court dynamics likely enhanced Jezebel's influence. As daughter of Tyre's king, she brought international prestige to a relatively young dynasty. Her connections facilitated valuable trade relationships and cultural exchanges that benefited Israel's economy. The Phoenician priests and attendants who arrived with her created a ready-made faction loyal to her within the palace structure. Ahab's religious position appears pragmatic rather than zealous. Unlike Jezebel, who actively promoted Baal worship, he seems to have practiced a syncretistic approach common among ancient rulers, honoring various deities as political necessity demanded. He maintained Yahweh's worship while allowing Baal's temples, hedging his spiritual bets while maximizing political advantage. Their children's names reveal this religious complexity. Some received traditional Yahwistic names containing the Hebrew divine element Yah or El, while others bore names honoring Baal. This naming pattern suggests not a household wholly dominated by Phoenician religion, but one where multiple traditions operated simultaneously, exactly the kind of compromise that would infuriate religious purists. Dinner conversations between this royal couple must have been fascinating. Did they discuss strategies for managing religious tensions? Did Ahab privately support policies he publicly distanced himself from? Did Jezebel understand her role as lightning rod, drawing prophetic criticism away from her husband? The biblical text offers tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. What seems clear is that they developed a functional partnership, whatever its internal power dynamics. Together, they governed Israel during a period of relative prosperity and military success. Their dynasty appeared secure, with sons prepared to continue their legacy. By conventional measures of ancient kingship, wealth, security, dynastic continuity, their reign succeeded despite prophetic condemnation. Perhaps this worldly success explains their confidence in the face of prophetic opposition. From their perspective, the doom-laden warnings of figures like Elijah contradicted their lived experience of divine favor expressed through material prosperity. When rain fell and crops flourished despite worship of Baal alongside Yahweh, why take seriously threats of divine punishment? This complacency would eventually prove fatal. The religious compromises that seemed politically expedient created deep divisions within Israelite society. The resentments Jezebel generated through her aggressive promotion of foreign worship created enemies waiting for opportunity. The prophetic movements they dismissed as irrelevant grew stronger through persecution. Ahab died as he had lived, a man of contradictions. Mortally wounded in battle despite disguising himself to avoid being targeted, he commanded his charioteer to prop him up facing the enemy so his troops wouldn't lose heart. This final act of kingly responsibility suggests a man more complex than a mere puppet. Whether player or played, Ahab's choices set in motion consequences that would eventually destroy everything he and Jezebel built together. The rise of the prophets. Wind swept across the dry hills of Gilead, rustling the rough camel hair garment of a solitary figure. From this remote region east of the Jordan emerged the man who would become Jezebel's greatest adversary, Elijah the Tishbite. His sudden appearance in the biblical narrative mirrors how prophets often entered Israel's political stage, unexpectedly, dramatically, from the margins rather than centers of power. Prophets weren't new to Israel. Since earliest times, figures like Moses, Deborah, and Samuel had spoken with divine authority. But the prophetic movement taking shape during Ahab and Jezebel's reign marked something different, more confrontational, more willing to challenge royal authority directly, more focused on calling Israel back to exclusive worship of Yahweh. These prophets stood outside the established religious system. Unlike priests with their hereditary positions and temple responsibilities, prophets emerged unpredictably from any social class or tribe. They claimed authority not from human appointment, but divine calling. Often described in visceral terms, the hand of the Lord came upon me, or the word of the Lord burned like fire in my bones. Their appearance reflected their countercultural message. Elijah's rough clothing and wild appearance created deliberate contrast with the cosmopolitan sophistication of Ahab's court. Later, his successor Elisha would be mocked for baldness, perhaps another visible rejection of court fashion with its carefully maintained hair and beards. These weren't diplomatic advisors, but disruptive truth-tellers. Their methods proved equally dramatic. Rather than submitting polite recommendations through proper channels, these prophets created public spectacles impossible to ignore. They performed symbolic actions, delivered messages in market squares, and confronted kings directly, regardless of protocol. Their goal wasn't to influence policy gradually, but to demand immediate return to covenant faithfulness. The content of their messages centered on exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. While court prophets often told kings what they wanted to hear, these independent voices delivered uncomfortable truths. Worship of Baal alongside Yahweh wasn't acceptable diplomatic accommodation, but spiritual adultery. Israel had one God, one covenant, one calling as a set-apart nation. Elijah exemplified this new prophetic model. His name itself, "My God is Yahweh," declared his message. He appeared without introduction before King Ahab, pronouncing drought in a direct challenge to Baal's supposed power over rainfall. This wasn't merely religious disagreement, but a public power contest between deities, with agricultural prosperity and human survival as stakes. For common Israelites, especially in rural areas, these prophets articulated growing concerns about foreign influence. The northern kingdom had always struggled with its religious identity after separation from Jerusalem's temple. Now, with Phoenician practices openly promoted by the queen, many feared losing their distinctive covenant relationship with Yahweh entirely. Jezebel's response to this prophetic challenge revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of Israel's religious dynamics. In Phoenicia, religious diversity was normal, and royal patronage directly controlled priesthoods. She expected similar arrangements in Israel, where kings from Jeroboam onward had established and modified worship sites. She failed to recognize that Yahweh's prophets claimed authority outside this system of royal control. Her persecution of Yahweh's prophets, described in the Bible as a systematic campaign of elimination, reflected both political calculation and religious conviction. From her perspective, these figures threatened the cultural integration she promoted and the royal authority she upheld. Their elimination seemed both practically necessary and religiously justified, as removing obstacles to Baal's rightful worship. This persecution created an unintended consequence. Prophets began organizing. The biblical text mentions the sons of the prophets, communities that formed around charismatic leaders like Elijah and later Elisha. These groups preserved traditions, provided mutual support, and trained new prophetic voices. Persecution intended to silence dissent instead institutionalized it. Obadiah, a high official in Ahab's court, represents the complicated position of those caught between competing religious loyalties. The Bible describes him hiding 100 prophets in caves, providing them food and water while maintaining his position in a court increasingly hostile to Yahweh worship. His story suggests widespread quiet resistance to Jezebel's religious policies, even among those outwardly conforming. As drought gripped the land, fulfilling Elijah's proclamation, tensions escalated toward inevitable confrontation. The material hardship brought spiritual questions into sharp focus. Which God truly controlled rain? Whose worship ensured prosperity? Was Israel's suffering punishment for covenant unfaithfulness or simply temporary natural disaster? The prophetic movement offered clear answers. Return exclusively to Yahweh, reject foreign gods, and prosperity would return. This message resonated particularly with rural populations already suspicious of urban cosmopolitanism and foreign customs. As conditions worsened under the drought, these arguments gained persuasive power. For Jezebel, however, the drought likely confirmed the need for more fervent Baal worship rather than its abandonment. From her theological perspective, the solution to Baal's withheld rain was more dedicated ritual, more priests, more sacrifices, precisely the opposite of what Elijah demanded. These irreconcilable religious frameworks made conflict inevitable. This rising prophetic movement, uncontrolled by royal authority, claiming direct divine inspiration, and increasingly organized despite persecution, created unprecedented challenge to monarchical power in Israel. No longer could kings modify religious practice without vocal opposition. No longer could political considerations simply override covenant obligations without prophetic protest. The stage was set for dramatic confrontation between royal authority and prophetic calling, between Phoenician religious inclusivity and Israelite covenantal exclusivity, between Jezebel's determination and Elijah's certainty. The theological disagreement had become inseparable from questions of power, identity, and Israel's very purpose as a nation. The War of the Gods begins. The third year of drought had baked the ground hard as iron. Streams dried to dusty riverbeds, crops withered in fields, livestock grew thin, then died. In palaces and peasant homes alike, hunger gnawed and thirst burned. This wasn't merely weather, but warfare, divine conflict playing out through human suffering. Elijah's pronouncement of drought directly challenged Baal's core identity as storm god who brought fertile rains. In Phoenician theology, Baal defeated the gods of death and drought in cosmic battle, ensuring agricultural prosperity through seasonal rainfall. Now, in Baal's supposed territory, rain had stopped. The theological implications hung in the air as heavy as the absent storm clouds. For Jezebel, this crisis demanded religious solution. Archaeological evidence throughout the region shows drought often triggered increased religious activity, more sacrifices, elaborate rituals, desperate prayers. As Baal's devoted follower, she likely intensified worship practices, funding additional priests and sacrifices to regain divine favor. The biblical text mentions 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table, suggesting royal patronage on an impressive scale. These weren't minor cult functionaries, but a substantial religious establishment maintained from the royal treasury. Their presence throughout Israel represented systematic effort to establish Phoenician worship alongside or replacing traditional Yahwism. Physical evidence of this religious transformation has emerged from archaeological excavations. Altars, sacred poles representing Asherah, and ritual objects associated with Canaanite deities appear in Israelite context during this period. Some households maintained small shrines with figurines representing Baal or Asherah alongside symbols of Yahweh, material confirmation of the religious mixing that prophets condemned. Architectural remains reveal temples constructed in Samaria and other cities following Phoenician designs rather than the Jerusalem temple pattern. These buildings made Baal worship visibly present in urban centers, normalized through impressive structures that rivaled or exceeded spaces dedicated to Yahweh. Stone masonry, imported cedar, and decorative elements all proclaimed royal approval of these new religious practices. For ordinary Israelites, these developments created daily dilemmas. Should they pass by Baal's temple or avoid it? Participate in public festivals honoring foreign gods or risk seeming disloyal? Maintain exclusive devotion to Yahweh or hedge their spiritual bets during drought, by honoring the storm god too. These weren't abstract theological questions, but practical decisions affecting social relationships, economic opportunities, and sometimes personal safety. Rural areas generally maintained stronger commitment to traditional Yahweh worship, while urban centers more readily accepted religious innovation. This geographic division reinforced existing tensions between cosmopolitan elites open to international influence and rural conservatives preserving ancestral practices. The religious conflict mapped onto social and economic divisions, deepening societal fractures. From hiding, Elijah watched these developments. The biblical narrative describes him at Kerith Brook, then in the home of a widow in Zarephath, ironically within Phoenician territory, where Jezebel's search parties wouldn't think to look. These years in seclusion weren't idle waiting, but preparation for the dramatic confrontation to come. Divine provision through ravens and the miraculous oil and flour demonstrated Yahweh's power even in Baal's homeland. When finally commanded to return, Elijah first approached Obadiah, the court official secretly sympathetic to Yahweh's prophets. Their cautious interaction reveals the atmosphere of fear surrounding religious dissent. Obadiah initially refused to tell Ahab about Elijah's return, certain the prophet would disappear again and leave him facing royal wrath. Only after solemn assurance did he agree to arrange the meeting. The confrontation between king and prophet crackled with tension. Ahab's greeting, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Blamed Elijah for the drought's suffering. The prophet's response redirected responsibility. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." This exchange captures the fundamental disagreement. From Ahab's perspective, Elijah's pronouncement caused the drought, making him responsible for years of suffering. From Elijah's view, the drought merely revealed consequences of the royal family's religious unfaithfulness. One saw political troublemaker, the other saw divine messenger. What followed ranks among Scripture's most dramatic scenes, Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal to public contest on Mount Carmel. This wasn't merely religious debate, but high-stakes theater with life-or-death consequences. Before assembled Israelites, fundamental questions would be answered. Which God controlled nature? Which worship ensured prosperity? Which religious tradition would define Israel's future? Elijah's challenge came with powerful rhetorical force. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. This framing rejected the syncretistic middle ground many Israelites had adopted. No more both and, the time had come for either or. No more hedged bets, absolute commitment was required. The prophets of Baal accepted the challenge, confident in their God's power. From morning until noon, they called on Baal, dancing around their altar with increasing desperation as no response came. Elijah's mockery, suggesting their God might be sleeping, traveling, or otherwise occupied, added humiliation to their growing panic. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they resorted to self-cutting, believing blood sacrifice might capture divine attention. When Elijah's turn came, he acted with deliberate ceremony. 12 stones rebuilt a ruined altar of Yahweh, representing Israel's 12 tribes and connecting present crisis to ancestral faith. 3 dousings with precious water demonstrated absolute confidence, making naturally unlikely fire even more impossible. His prayer, brief and direct, centered on covenant relationship rather than magical manipulation. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God." Fire fell from heaven, consuming not just sacrifice, but wood, stones, soil, and water. The assembled Israelites fell prostrate, crying, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" In this moment of religious clarity, Elijah commanded Baal's prophets seized. Their execution at the Kishon Valley, shocking to modern readers, but consistent with ancient understanding of false prophecy's consequences, eliminated Jezebel's religious leadership in one decisive stroke. Rain clouds gathered on the horizon. The 3-year drought ended with drenching downpour. Elijah, divinely energized, outran Ahab's chariot back to Jezreel. The contest appeared decisively settled. Yahweh controlled rain, not Baal. Yahweh answered prayer, while Baal remained silent. Yahweh's prophet demonstrated power, while Baal's priests met death. But one person remained unconvinced. When news reached Jezebel of her prophet's execution, her response wasn't doubt or conversion, but furious determination. The battle for Israel's religious identity had only just begun. Jezebel's purge. The once peaceful halls of Samaria now echoed with whispers of fear. Jezebel had grown tired of sharing the kingdom with followers of Yahweh. Her patience for religious diversity had worn thin, replaced by a fierce desire to secure her vision for Israel's future. Under the warm Mediterranean sun, royal guards moved through villages and towns with lists of names. These weren't ordinary criminals they sought, but prophets, men and women who spoke for Yahweh. The queen had marked them as enemies of the crown. Jezebel funded new temples across the northern kingdom, their white stone walls rising like declarations of her power. Inside these sanctuaries, priests of Baal and priestesses of Asherah conducted rituals that felt foreign to many Israelites. The smoke from their altars mixed with incense, creating a fragrant cloud that some found comforting, others threatening. "The old ways are dying," whispered mothers to their children as they passed these new temples. "The queen seeks to change everything we know." From her palace in Samaria, Jezebel directed what many would later call a purge. Prophets who refused to acknowledge Baal disappeared in the night. Some fled to caves in distant hills, hiding among rocks and surviving on what little food sympathetic villagers could spare. Others weren't so fortunate. Obadiah, a palace official who secretly held faith in Yahweh, risked everything to hide 100 prophets in 2 caves. He brought them bread and water, moving only under cover of darkness. His hands shook each time he approached the palace gates, fearing discovery. Meanwhile, the queen's influence spread through the court. Those who wished for royal favor adopted Phoenician customs, clothing styles, and religious practices. They spoke Jezebel's native tongue and hung symbols of Baal in their homes. Ambition became entangled with cultural change. Throughout the countryside, ordinary people made quiet choices. Some hid small altars to Yahweh beneath their floorboards. Others decided the risk wasn't worth taking and joined in the new rituals. Families split along invisible lines of faith. What made Jezebel's actions more than mere political maneuvering was her genuine belief. In her mind, she brought enlightenment to a backward nation. The gods who had made Phoenicia wealthy and powerful could do the same for Israel. Why wouldn't she share such gifts with her adopted homeland? As the seasons changed, the voice of Yahweh grew fainter across the northern kingdom. Prophets went silent or spoke only in shadows. The queen's purge had accomplished much of what she intended. For now, at least, Baal's thunder seemed to drown out Yahweh's whisper. Mount Carmel and the fire-dark clouds gathered over Mount Carmel, a sign perhaps of the confrontation brewing on its slopes. After years of hiding and silence, one man decided the time had come for a divine showdown. Elijah the Tishbite, wild-haired and leather-clad, sent word to King Ahab, "Meet me on Mount Carmel and bring your prophets." The drought had lasted 3 years. Fields lay cracked and barren. Children went to bed hungry. Even the wealthy felt the squeeze of empty storehouses. Many blamed this suffering on the abandonment of Yahweh, and Elijah used this sentiment to set the stage for his challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions?" Elijah called to the gathered crowd. His voice carried across the mountaintop where hundreds had climbed to witness this contest of gods. "If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." The people stood silent, caught between fear of the queen and curiosity about what might unfold. Ahab watched from beneath a canopy, his face unreadable. Messengers had been sent to inform Jezebel, but she remained in the palace, perhaps sensing a trap. Elijah proposed a test: 2 altars, 2 bulls for sacrifice, but no fire. Each side would call on their deity to send flames from heaven. The God who answered would be declared the true God of Israel. The prophets of Baal went first. 450 men danced around their altar from morning until noon. They chanted and called to their God, "Baal, answer us!" As hours passed with no response, their movements grew frantic. They cut themselves with swords and spears, their blood mixing with sweat on the dry ground. "Perhaps your God is sleeping," Elijah taunted. "Call louder." His mockery stung, but the prophets of Baal continued until evening, their voices growing hoarse, their bodies weary. When the sun began to set, Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt an old altar to Yahweh using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. Around it, he dug a trench. After arranging wood and placing the bull on top, he called for water. In a land parched by drought, using water this way seemed foolish, even offensive. Yet 4 large jars of water were poured over the sacrifice, then 4 more, then 4 again until the trench overflowed. As twilight painted the sky in deep purples and blues, Elijah lifted his hands. "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed, his voice steady and calm amid the tension. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel." Fire fell from heaven. Not a spark or a flicker, but a blaze so intense it consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even licked up the water in the trench. The gathered crowd fell to their knees, faces pressed to the earth. "Yahweh is God," they cried out. "Yahweh is God." What happened next would haunt the kingdom for generations. Elijah, emboldened by divine validation, called for the seizure of Baal's prophets. 450 men were taken to the Kishon Valley below and slaughtered. Their blood flowed into the dry riverbed, a crimson testament to religious fervor turned violent. As rain clouds finally gathered on the horizon, messengers raced towards Samaria with news Jezebel would find unthinkable. Her carefully cultivated religious order had just been upended by a single prophet and a spectacular display of power. A queen's vow. Dawn broke over Samaria, painting the limestone walls a soft pink. Inside the palace, a storm was brewing. Jezebel stood motionless as the messenger delivered the news from Mount Carmel. Her priests, dead. Her religion, publicly humiliated. Her authority, challenged before all Israel. Those who knew the queen well stepped back, recognizing the dangerous stillness that had settled over her. This wasn't defeat, she felt, but rage, a cold, calculating fury that would not be easily quenched. "So," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "this prophet thinks he has won." She moved to the window, looking out over the city she had transformed. 3 years of drought had ended with Elijah's victory, and rain now fell on her adopted homeland. The people would see this as Yahweh's blessing. Without turning around, she dictated a message to be sent immediately to Elijah. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of my slain prophets." This wasn't merely a threat, but a sacred vow. By invoking the gods, Jezebel bound herself to this course of action. The messenger blanched at the words, but knew better than to question the queen. Within the hour, riders departed Samaria, carrying her promise of vengeance. When Elijah received the message, something unexpected happened. This man who had faced 450 prophets of Baal, who had called down fire from heaven, who had ordered their execution without hesitation, this same man now fled in fear. A woman's oath had accomplished what an army could not. He ran south beyond the borders of Israel, beyond even the kingdom of Judah, into the wilderness. Under a broom tree, exhausted and dejected, he asked for death. "I have had enough, Yahweh," he prayed. "Take my life." Back in Samaria, Jezebel set her network of spies in motion. Every road was watched, every village questioned. She would find this prophet who had humiliated her, who had destroyed years of careful religious and political maneuvering in a single afternoon. For the people of Israel, the conflict took on deeper meaning. This wasn't simply a clash between a queen and a prophet. It represented fundamental questions about power and truth. Could a foreign-born queen impose her will on a nation? Could a lone prophet stand against royal authority? Whose God would shape Israel's destiny? In the courts of neighboring kingdoms, officials whispered about the drama unfolding in Israel. Some saw it as mere religious squabbling. Others recognized the political implications. A monarch whose religious authority was successfully challenged might soon face questions about their right to rule in other matters as well. As days turned to weeks, Elijah remained hidden, guided by divine protection to Mount Horeb far to the south. There, in the silence after wind, earthquake and fire, he would hear the still small voice that would guide his next steps. Jezebel, meanwhile, understood the threat hadn't passed. Though she had driven Elijah from the kingdom, his victory at Mount Carmel had kindled a renewed devotion to Yahweh among many Israelites. Her vow remained unfulfilled, a debt she intended to pay in full when the opportunity arose. Naboth's vineyard. Just beyond the walls of Jezreel, where the royal family kept their winter palace, stretched a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. These weren't ordinary vines, but plants tended by the same family for generations, passed down from father to son as a sacred inheritance. Ahab had taken a liking to this plot of land. From his window, he could see the neat rows of vines, the careful irrigation channels, the rich soil that produced sweet grapes. This would make a fine vegetable garden, he mused one afternoon, so close to the palace. The king approached Naboth with what he considered a generous offer. "Give me your vineyard. I'll give you a better vineyard elsewhere, or I'll pay whatever price you think fair." But Naboth refused. "Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." This wasn't stubbornness or greed. For Israelites, ancestral land represented a divine covenant, a physical connection to their heritage and identity. Selling it would dishonor both his ancestors and his God. Ahab returned to the palace, sulking like a child denied a treat. He lay on his bed, facing the wall, refusing food, wounded by this commoner's defiance. When Jezebel found him in this state and learned the cause, she was baffled by his behavior. "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" she asked, her voice laced with disdain. "Get up and eat something. Cheer up, I'll get you the vineyard." With the royal seal in hand, Jezebel wrote letters to the elders and nobles of Jezreel. Her plan unfolded with chilling precision: proclaim a day of fasting, seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people, then have two scoundrels falsely accuse him of cursing both God and king. The local officials, eager to please the queen, followed her instructions without question. Under the pretense of piety, they orchestrated Naboth's downfall. The day arrived, the accusations were made, witnesses swore to lies, and the crowd's mood turned dark. No trial, no defense, no mercy, just stones crashing against flesh until Naboth lay still. Word reached the palace quickly: Naboth is dead. Jezebel turned to her husband with the news he wanted to hear. "Get up and take possession of the vineyard. Naboth refused to sell you. He is no longer alive." Ahab rose from his bed, his melancholy forgotten. He walked down to the vineyard, perhaps already planning where he would plant herbs and vegetables. As he surveyed his new acquisition, he failed to notice the solitary figure approaching from the hills. Elijah had returned, summoned by divine command to confront the king. Their meeting among the vines Naboth had tended would become infamous in Israel's memory. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked, his voice betraying his unease. "I have found you," replied the prophet, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of Yahweh." Then came the pronouncement that would haunt the royal couple. "In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood." And for Jezebel, an even more terrible fate awaited. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. What made this incident so revealing wasn't just the murder itself, but how it was accomplished. Jezebel used the language and structures of Israelite law and religion. A fast day, a public assembly, the requirement for two witnesses to pervert justice. She didn't simply ignore Yahweh's law. She weaponized it. For many in Israel, the vineyard became a symbol of royal overreach, of power corrupting justice. Farmers whispered about it while tending their own lands. Elders spoke of it in hushed tones as a cautionary tale. Even in neighboring kingdoms, the story spread as a warning about unchecked authority. The prophet returns. 3 years had passed since Elijah's dramatic confrontation with Ahab in Naboth's vineyard. The prophet had become like a shadow across the kingdom, appearing suddenly, delivering unwelcome messages, then vanishing again. His name was whispered with both reverence and fear. Now he returned to find Israel preparing for war. Ben-Hadad of Aram threatened the northern borders, his armies gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Ahab, despite his spiritual failings, proved himself a capable military strategist as he organized Israel's defense. In his council chamber, advisors debated tactics while messengers arrived with updates on enemy movements. Into this tense atmosphere walked an unfamiliar prophet. Not Elijah, but one of the many who had begun to emerge from hiding as Jezebel's influence waned in matters of state, if not in the royal household. "This is what Yahweh says," declared the prophet. "Do you see this vast army? I will give it into your hand today, and then you will know that I am Yahweh." Ahab, pragmatic even in his idolatry, asked, "By whom?" "By the junior officers under the provincial commanders," came the reply. The king followed this divine strategy, sending 232 young officers ahead of his army of 7,000. Against all military wisdom, Israel won a stunning victory. Ben-Hadad escaped on horseback with some cavalry. but his army lay scattered and broken. The prophet returned with a warning: strengthen your position and see what must be done, because next spring the king of Aram will attack you again. Meanwhile, in Damascus, Ben-Hadad's advisors offered an explanation for their defeat. Their gods are gods of the hills. That's why they were too strong for us. But if we fight them on the plains, we'll certainly defeat them. When spring came, the armies met at Aphek on the plains. Israel's forces looked like two small flocks of goats compared to the Arameans who filled the countryside. Yet again, victory came to Ahab's forces. 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers fell in a single day, and Ben-Hadad surrendered. Instead of executing his defeated enemy, Ahab called him brother and made a treaty. Cities previously taken from Israel would be returned, and Israelite merchants would be allowed to set up markets in Damascus. To many, this seemed a shrewd diplomatic move, but not to Elijah. The prophets saw this alliance as compromise with evil, another example of Ahab placing political expediency above divine commands. Through a symbolic act, asking a man to strike him and then wearing a bandage as disguise, another prophet confronted Ahab on the road back from his victory. This is what Yahweh says: "You have set free a man I had determined should die. Therefore it is your life for his life, your people for his people." Ahab returned to Samaria sullen and angry. Victory had turned to ash in his mouth. Despite his military successes, the king couldn't escape the shadow of prophetic condemnation that seemed to follow his every decision. For Jezebel, these divine interventions in military affairs represented another threat to her influence. The victories attributed to Yahweh strengthened the very religious faction she had sought to eliminate. Her husband increasingly found himself torn between her counsel and the warnings of prophets who kept emerging despite her efforts. In the markets and villages, people began speaking more openly about Yahweh again. They retold stories of the drought, of Mount Carmel, of victories against overwhelming odds. Something was shifting in Israel, a quiet revival of old faith, a growing resistance to Phoenician customs. Elijah watched these developments from a distance, training a successor named Elisha. The older prophet understood his own work was nearing completion. New voices would soon rise to challenge the crown. New confrontations would test the nation's soul. The arrow in the chariot. Rumors of another war reached the palace in Samaria. This time, it wasn't the Arameans who threatened Israel, but the growing power of Assyria to the east. Ahab, ever the pragmatist, formed an alliance with his former enemy Ben-Hadad and King Jehoshaphat of Judah to stand against this common threat. Before marching to battle, Jehoshaphat, a devout follower of Yahweh, requested they seek divine guidance. Ahab gathered 400 prophets who served in his court, men who had learned to blend mention of Yahweh with messages the king wanted to hear. "Go," they said in unison, "for the Lord will give it into the king's hand." Something about their eagerness made Jehoshaphat uneasy. "Is there no longer a prophet of Yahweh here whom we can inquire of?" he asked. Ahab's face darkened. "There is still one prophet through whom we can inquire of Yahweh, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." While a messenger went to fetch Micaiah, a prophet named Zedekiah made iron horns and pranced about, declaring, "With these you will gore the Arameans until they are destroyed." The other prophets echoed his enthusiasm. The messenger found Micaiah and advised him to agree with the other prophets. His response revealed much about prophetic integrity in those troubled times. "As surely as Yahweh lives, I can tell him only what Yahweh tells me." Before the assembled kings, Micaiah initially echoed the court prophet's message. His tone, however, carried such obvious sarcasm that Ahab demanded, "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of Yahweh?" Then Micaiah's countenance changed. He described a vision of the Lord allowing a lying spirit to entice Ahab through his prophets. His real message: disaster awaited the king in battle. For this unwelcome truth, Micaiah was struck on the face and sent to prison. Zedekiah, the prophet with iron horns, challenged him, "Which way did the spirit from Yahweh go when he went from me to speak to you?" "You will find out on the day you go to hide in an inner room," Micaiah replied, forecasting the fate awaiting false prophets when his words proved true. Despite the warning, Ahab prepared for battle. In a telling decision that mixed superstition with strategy, he disguised himself as a common soldier while asking Jehoshaphat to wear royal robes. Perhaps he hoped to evade not just enemy archers, but the prophesied judgment as well. The battlefield near Ramoth Gilead became a swirling chaos of chariots, horses, and foot soldiers. The king of Aram had given specific orders: don't fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel. His captains initially pursued Jehoshaphat, mistaking him for Ahab, until they realized their error. Meanwhile, an Aramean soldier drew his bow at random and released an arrow into the fray. This seemingly chance shot found a gap in Ahab's armor, striking between the sections of his breastplate. The king remained propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans while blood pooled at his feet. By sunset, he was dead. As his body was brought back to Samaria, attendants washed his blood-soaked chariot at a pool where prostitutes bathed. Dogs came and licked the water mixed with royal blood. Elijah's prophecy, spoken after Naboth's murder, had found its fulfillment. For Jezebel, Ahab's death marked a crucial turning point. Her position now depended on her sons, rather than her husband. As queen mother, she would retain significant influence, especially because her eldest son, Ahaziah, was cut from similar cloth as his father. Throughout Israel, news of the king's death and the manner of it, the disguise that failed, the random arrow that found its mark, the dogs licking his blood, seemed to confirm what the prophets had insisted all along. No one, not even a king, could escape divine judgment forever. Yet even as her husband's body was laid in a tomb, Jezebel refused to see these events as anything more than coincidence or the fortunes of war. Her gods remained powerful in her eyes, her mission to transform Israel unfinished. The next phase of her life would be defined not by being a wife, but by being a mother to kings, sons and thrones. Ahaziah, eldest son of Ahab and Jezebel, ascended the throne in Samaria amid whispers and uncertainty. His reign began as the kingdom still processed the shocking death of his father. Would the son follow the father's path? Palace courtiers watched closely for signs of who truly held influence over the new king. They didn't have to wait long. Ahaziah quickly showed himself his mother's son, continuing the devotion to Baal that had marked his parents' reign. The temples Jezebel had built remained active, their priests still influential. If anything, the young king seemed even more committed to Phoenician religious practices than his father had been. For Jezebel, this represented a restoration of her authority. No longer merely the foreign queen brought to cement an alliance, she now held the revered position of queen mother. From her private chambers, she advised her son on matters both sacred and secular. Some claim no decree left the palace without her approval. Across the border in Judah, King Jehoshaphat watched these developments with concern. His own kingdom maintained devotion to Yahweh, creating a religious and cultural divide between the sister nations that grew deeper with each generation. Yet political realities demanded continued cooperation against common enemies. Ahaziah's reign proved unexpectedly brief. While inspecting an upper room in his palace, he fell through the lattice of a window, suffering injuries that left him bedridden. Pain-racked and uncertain of recovery, he sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, god of Ekron, whether he would survive. On the road to Ekron, the messengers encountered Elijah. The aging prophet, his face weathered by years in the wilderness, delivered his final recorded message to the house of Ahab. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub? The king will not leave the bed he lies on. He will certainly die. When the messengers returned and described the man who had intercepted them, Ahaziah immediately recognized Elijah. Despite his weakened state, the king sent soldiers to apprehend the prophet. 2 captains and their 50 men were consumed by fire from heaven before a third approached with humility, begging for his life. Elijah then personally delivered his message to the dying king. Shortly after, Ahaziah died childless, having reigned only 2 years. The crown passed to his brother Joram, also called Jehoram. The transition created a moment of possibility. Would Jezebel's second son chart a different course? Those hoping for change saw early promising signs. Scripture records that Joram did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made. This partial reform Removing certain Baal symbols while maintaining other aspects of foreign worship suggested inner conflict. Perhaps Joram recognized the political wisdom of appeasing Yahweh's followers without fully embracing their faith. Or perhaps he genuinely sought a middle path between his mother's religion and the traditional faith of Israel. For Jezebel, her son's actions likely represented a concerning compromise. The very symbols she had worked to establish throughout the kingdom were now being removed by her own son. Yet she remained influential, adapting her approach to this new reality. Around this time, Elijah's ministry drew to a close. In one of the most mysterious episodes in biblical history, he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, witnessed only by his protege, Elisha. The mantle of prophetic authority literally fell to Elisha, who would continue the divine confrontation with Jezebel's influence. Joram's reign coincided with continued military threats. Moab, which had paid tribute to Israel, rebelled after Ahab's death. Joram formed an alliance with Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom to suppress this rebellion. When their armies faced a water shortage in the desert, they consulted Elisha. The prophet's response revealed his view of Joram. What do we have to do with each other? Go to your father's prophets or your mother's prophets. Only out of respect for Jehoshaphat did Elisha provide guidance that saved the allied armies. This incident highlighted the continued spiritual divide within Israel's royal house. Joram stood between two worlds, the Baal worship of his parents and the Yahweh worship Elisha represented. His middle position pleased neither side fully and would ultimately prove unsustainable. Throughout these years, Jezebel remained a powerful presence in the court, though increasingly in the background. Her direct authority had diminished, but her influence through her son continued. She watched carefully as prophetic power grew and challenged royal prerogatives once again. Elijah's legacy and Elisha's rise, a new kind of prophet walked the dusty roads of Israel. Where Elijah had been fire and thunder, confronting kings directly, Elisha moved more quietly among ordinary people. His miracles often touched daily life, healing waters, multiplying food, restoring life to the dead. This shift in prophetic style didn't mean reduced power, but rather power redirected. After Elijah's dramatic departure in a whirlwind, witnessed only by Elisha, stories of the new prophet began spreading through villages and towns. Women whispered about the jar of oil that never ran dry, saving a widow from creditors. Farmers spoke of an axe head that floated in water, retrieved against all natural laws. Travelers told of poisoned stew made edible with just a handful of flour. These weren't just wonders for wonder's sake. Each miracle reinforced a message. Yahweh cared about ordinary lives, about justice and compassion, about the daily struggles of people often overlooked by the powerful. Perhaps most significant was Elisha's healing of Naaman, commander of Aram's army. This foreign military leader, suffering from leprosy, found healing by washing in the Jordan River at Elisha's instruction. When Naaman offered rich rewards, Elisha refused payment, emphasizing that divine healing wasn't a commodity to be purchased. Gehazi, Elisha's servant, couldn't resist the temptation of wealth. He secretly approached Naaman, claimed Elisha had changed his mind, and accepted gifts. His punishment, contracting the very leprosy Naaman had been cured of, became another object lesson about greed and dishonesty in spiritual matters. All these events occurred while Jezebel remained in the palace, still wielding influence through her son Joram. The contrast couldn't have been starker, a queen who had used royal power to impose her religion from above, and a prophet who built a movement from below, miracle by miracle, village by village. In some ways, Elisha proved more dangerous to Jezebel's legacy than Elijah had been. Elijah had confronted power directly, creating dramatic moments of conflict that required only the silencing of one man. Elisha, by embedding Yahweh worship in everyday life across countless communities, created a movement too diffuse to easily suppress. The schools of prophets that Elisha established throughout Israel became centers of resistance to Baal worship and royal overreach. Young men trained in these communities carried the messages and values of Yahweh worship to every corner of the kingdom. What had once been a handful of prophets hiding in caves during Jezebel's purge was becoming an organized spiritual force. Jezebel surely recognized the threat. From her chambers in Samaria and Jezreel, she watched this growing movement with concern. Her son Joram had already compromised by removing some Baal symbols. Now the common people increasingly turned to Elisha rather than royal authority for guidance and help. Stories reached the palace of Elisha's uncanny knowledge, how he could reveal private words spoken in the king of Aram's bedroom, frustrating planned attacks against Israel. One tale told how the prophet had once been surrounded by enemy forces sent specifically to capture him. When his servant panicked, Elisha prayed for the young man's eyes to be opened, revealing the hills full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding them for protection. This wasn't just a spiritual contest anymore, but a struggle for the heart and future of the nation. Would Israel follow the path of its neighbors, with religion dictated by royal preference, or would the prophetic tradition, insisting on justice, compassion, and fidelity to Yahweh's commands, regardless of royal policy, prevail? Joram found himself caught between these competing visions. His mother represented one path, Elisha another. The king's partial reform satisfied neither camp fully and left him vulnerable to challenges from both directions. For Jezebel, now aging but still formidable, these years must have brought frustration. The religious transformation she had envisioned for Israel remained incomplete. Her influence, while still significant, faced growing opposition from a prophetic movement that showed no signs of weakening. What neither Jezebel nor Joram yet realized was that Elisha's quiet revolution was about to take a more direct political turn. The prophet who had focused on miracles among common people was preparing to reshape the very power structure of the kingdom. The whisper of revolution. In a quiet moment, away from palace spies and courtly intrigues, Elisha summoned a young prophet from among his disciples. The room smelled of oil and herbs as Elisha handed over a small flask, its contents ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in purpose. "Tuck this oil flask inside your cloak," Elisha instructed, his voice low. "Go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, look for Jehu son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi." Jehu wasn't a random choice. As a military commander who had served under both Ahab and Joram, he represented the strength of Israel's army. His reputation for bold, even reckless action preceded him. "He drives like Jehu," people would say of anyone racing a chariot with unusual speed. Elisha's instructions continued with deadly precision. Get him away from his companions and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask and pour the oil on his head and declare, "This is what Yahweh says, I anoint you king over Israel." This wasn't merely a religious ritual, but an act of treason. Joram remained the legitimate king of Israel. Anointing another would spark civil war, a prospect that didn't seem to trouble Elisha. After years of quiet ministry among the people, the prophet had chosen a path of direct political intervention. "Open the door and run. Don't delay," Elisha added, acknowledging the danger of the mission. The young prophet traveled to Ramoth Gilead, where Israel's army was guarding against threats from Aram. He found Jehu sitting with other officers, perhaps discussing military strategies, or simply sharing stories to pass the time between duties. "I have a message for you, Commander," the young man said. "For which one of us?" Jehu asked. "For you, Commander." Inside a private room, the prophet poured oil on Jehu's head, the cool liquid running down his face into his beard. "This is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over Yahweh's people, Israel. You are to destroy the house of Ahab, your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants the prophets and the blood of all Yahweh's servants shed by Jezebel." The young prophet continued with graphic details about the coming destruction of Ahab's entire family, concluding with specific mention of Jezebel. "Dogs will devour Jezebel on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her." His message delivered, the prophet opened the door and fled, leaving Jehu alone with an extraordinary decision. Should he accept this divine appointment and move against his king, or dismiss the encounter as the act of a madman, as his fellow officers would soon suggest? When Jehu rejoined his companions, they immediately sensed something had changed. "Why did this madman come to you?" they asked. "You know the man and his babble," Jehu replied evasively. But they pressed him. "That's not true. Tell us." Finally, Jehu revealed what had happened. He said, "This is what Yahweh says. I anoint you king over Israel." What followed revealed much about feelings toward Joram's rule and Jezebel's lingering influence among the military. Instead of reporting this treasonous act to their king, the officers immediately recognized Jehu as their new leader. They spread their cloaks on the bare steps beneath his feet, creating an impromptu royal carpet. Someone blew a trumpet, and shouts echoed through the camp, "Jehu is king!" The quiet whisper of revolution had begun. In a distant military outpost, far from the watchful eyes of Jezebel, a new king had been proclaimed. The oil on Jehu's head was still fresh, but already the wheels of destiny had begun turning toward a bloody conclusion. Jehu acted with characteristic decisiveness. "If you want me as your king," he told his fellow officers, "don't let anyone slip out of the city to warn Jezreel." The city gates were sealed as Jehu prepared his chariots for the journey that would change Israel forever. Meanwhile, in the palace at Jezreel, Jezebel and Joram remained unaware of the approaching storm. The revolution beginning at Ramoth-Gilead represented everything the queen had fought against for decades: the triumph of Yahweh worship, the rejection of her religious vision for Israel, and most personally, a direct threat to the dynasty she had worked so hard to establish. The prophetic whisper that had started with Elisha would soon become a shout heard across the kingdom, bringing judgment upon the house of Ahab and the queen who had defied Yahweh. For now, though, it remained a secret shared among soldiers preparing for battle against their own king. Jehu's ride. The royal court of Israel had no idea what was coming. Far away from the palace, a quiet meeting took place, one that would change everything. Elisha, the prophet who followed in Elijah's footsteps, sent a young man with a flask of oil to find a military commander named Jehu. The messenger found him sitting with his fellow officers. "I have a message for you, Commander," the young prophet said, taking Jehu to a private room. There, he poured the sacred oil over Jehu's head, marking him as the next king of Israel. The words that followed must have sent chills down Jehu's spine. "Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. You shall strike down the house of Ahab. I will avenge the blood of my servants the prophets at the hand of Jezebel." The young man fled as soon as the words left his lips, leaving Jehu to face his curious officers. When they asked what the madman wanted, Jehu tried to brush it off, but they pressed him until he shared the truth. He had been anointed king. In that moment, something shifted. These rough soldiers, seeing an opportunity, took off their cloaks and spread them beneath Jehu's feet, creating a makeshift royal carpet. They blew trumpets and shouted, "Jehu is king!" The coup had begun, but speed was essential. If word reached Jezreel before Jehu, all would be lost. Messengers might warn the royal family, defenses would rise. The element of surprise would vanish like morning dew. So Jehu ordered his men to let no one leave to carry news. Then he climbed into his chariot. The reins felt different in his hands now. These were a king's hands, not merely a commander's. The horses sensed his urgency as he whipped them into a gallop toward Jezreel, where Jezebel and her son Joram waited, unaware. The Bible tells us Jehu drove furiously. Picture this scene: dust clouds rising behind racing chariots, the thunder of hooves, the creak of wooden wheels spinning faster and faster. Jehu's face set like flint, his eyes fixed on the horizon. This was no casual journey. This was destiny charging forward at breakneck speed. A watchman on Jezreel's tower spotted the approach of chariots on the distant road, just a dust cloud at first, then the unmistakable shape of men and horses moving with purpose. King Joram, still recovering from wounds received in battle with the Arameans, sent out a horseman to meet the approaching company. "Is it peace?" the messenger called out, the common greeting of the day, but loaded with meaning in this tense moment. Jehu's reply cut through any pretense. "What peace, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" The messenger did not return. Neither did a second one sent by the increasingly worried king. Both joined Jehu's ranks instead, swelling the force that raced toward the unwitting royal house. The watchman on the tower must have felt his heart sink as he reported this strange development to his king. Something was very wrong, and the dogs of Jezreel began to howl. The fall of Joram morning light touched the walls of Jezreel as two chariots rolled out from the city gates. In one sat King Joram of Israel, Jezebel's son. In the other, his cousin Ahaziah, king of Judah, who had come to visit his wounded relative. Both men, descendants of powerful dynasties, rode together to meet the approaching force. They found Jehu near the vineyard that once belonged to Naboth, that same plot of land that Jezebel had stolen through murder and lies years before. The place where blood had soaked the ground now became the setting for bloodshed once more. History has a way of finding perfect circles. "Is it peace, Jehu?" called Joram, echoing the question his messengers had asked. Jehu's answer hung in the air like smoke before a fire. "What peace so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many?" In that moment, Joram understood everything. "Treachery!" he cried, turning his chariot to flee. But his warning to Ahaziah came too late. Jehu, whose name means Yahweh is He, drew his bow with remarkable strength. The arrow flew straight and true, striking Joram between the shoulders, piercing through his heart. The king of Israel slumped forward in his chariot, his blood pooling at his feet. "Take him and throw him on the field of Naboth," Jehu commanded his officer Bidkar. "Remember how we rode together behind his father Ahab, and the Lord uttered this prophecy against him. Surely I saw yesterday the blood of Naboth and his sons, and I will repay you in this plot of ground." So Joram's body was tossed onto the very land his mother had stolen, justice coming full circle in a way that even Jehu recognized as fitting. The land that Jezebel had taken through corrupt justice now received the body of her son. King Ahaziah of Judah, witnessing his cousin's murder, fled in terror. Jehu's men pursued him, wounding him in his chariot. Though he escaped to nearby Megiddo, his wounds proved fatal. The house of Ahab was falling, one member at a time. With Joram dead, nothing stood between Jehu and Jezreel except the city gates and the queen mother who waited behind them. The news of her son's death would soon reach her ears, carried on the same wind that brought the dust from Jehu's approaching chariot. The wheel of prophecy, set in motion years before by Elijah on the slopes of Mount Carmel, was now spinning faster. The ground was about to receive more blood, and the dogs of Jezreel grew restless, as if sensing that their prophesied meal was drawing near. Jezebel's last stand. When news reached the palace that Joram was dead, something remarkable happened. Jezebel, now an aging queen mother who had survived decades of political storms, did not flee. She did not hide in the palace depths or beg for mercy. Instead, she prepared for one final act of defiance. First, she painted her eyes with kohl, the dark cosmetic that had been part of royal regalia since Egyptian times. Then she arranged her hair carefully, adorning herself as befitted a queen. Some scholars suggest she dressed in her full royal attire, perhaps even her Sidonian priestess garments. This was not vanity in the face of death. This was strategy. Jezebel knew the power of symbols. She had ruled through them for decades. Now, facing her end, she chose to meet death not as a frightened woman, but as a queen, as a priestess, as her true self. She positioned herself at the upper window of the palace, visible to anyone entering the city gate. When Jehu's chariot thundered through the entrance of Jezreel, she was ready. Her silhouette appeared in the window above him, regal, defiant, unmistakable. "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" she called down. These weren't random words. They were carefully chosen barbs. By calling him Zimri, she compared Jehu to a previous usurper who had ruled Israel for only 7 days before his violent death. The message was clear. You may kill me, but history will judge you harshly. Jehu looked up at the window, at this woman who had dominated Israel's politics for decades, the queen who had nearly wiped out Yahweh worship, the foreigner who had brought Baal into the heart of Israel, his nemesis. "Who is on my side?" "Who?" he shouted. The response came from within the palace itself. 2 or 3 eunuchs, palace officials who served the royal household, appeared at the window beside Jezebel. Men who had bowed to her for years now faced a choice. Remain loyal to a falling queen or join the rising power. "Throw her down," Jehu commanded. The Bible's account is stark in its simplicity. So they threw her down. Imagine that moment, hands that had served her now seizing her body. The queen's cry cut short as she fell through the air. The impact of flesh on stone, blood splattering the palace walls and Jehu's chariot wheels. Jehu showed no remorse. He drove his chariot over her body, grinding flesh and bones under hooves and wheels. Then he went into the palace to eat and drink, claiming his victory meal in what was now his palace. Only after satisfying his hunger did he show a moment of humanity. "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter," he ordered. But when servants went to collect Jezebel's remains, they found almost nothing left. Just her skull, feet, and the palms of her hands. The rest had been devoured by the street dogs of Jezreel, exactly as Elijah had prophesied years before. Jezebel's last stand had ended. Her defiance echoed in an empty window above a blood-stained street. The dogs and the prophecy night settled over Jezreel, bringing with it an eerie quiet. The palace halls where once Jezebel's voice commanded and counseled now echoed with Jehu's victory feasts. Outside in the streets, shadows moved in the darkness, the hungry dogs of the city drawn by the scent of blood. Years earlier, the prophet Elijah had stood before Ahab with fire in his eyes and spoken words that seemed impossible at the time. In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick your blood. And of Jezebel, the prophecy was even more specific. The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Words spoken in fire had become flesh and blood reality. The street dogs of ancient cities were not pets, but scavengers, semi-wild creatures that cleaned the refuse and sometimes posed danger to the unwary. Now they performed their final service to prophecy, consuming the body of the queen, who had once threatened to make Elijah himself like one of her slaughtered prophets. When morning came and Jehu's men went to bury her, they found the prophecy fulfilled with uncanny precision. Only her skull remained, along with her feet and the palms of her hands. A particularly gruesome detail the biblical text doesn't shy away from mentioning. Why these parts remained is a detail scholars have puzzled over. Some suggest that the skull was left because of the cosmetics and dyes in her hair, making it unpalatable to the animals. The hands and feet, with their tougher skin and reduced flesh, might similarly have been less appetizing. Whatever the reason, the partial remains created a final indignity. There wasn't enough left of Jezebel to provide a proper burial. When they returned and told Jehu what they'd found, he nodded grimly. "This is the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field." The queen who had built temples and commanded kings had become food for scavengers, her remains scattered in the city streets. It was a powerful message for those who witnessed it. Divine judgment made visible in the most visceral way. For the biblical writers, this end served as the perfect moral capstone to Jezebel's story. Her death wasn't just a political assassination. It was portrayed as divine justice. The woman who had defied Yahweh now lay scattered and unburied, a fate considered horrific in ancient Near Eastern culture where proper burial rites were sacred. Yet even in this gruesome end, there's something worth noting. Jezebel never ran. She never begged. She never renounced her gods or her principles. She remained true to her identity until the very end, meeting death with painted eyes and cutting words. The dogs of Jezreel had fulfilled their prophetic role. The blood had been licked up. But the story of Jezebel was far from over. It was just beginning its long journey through human memory and imagination. The aftershock dawn broke over a changed Israel. Jehu, the newly self-proclaimed king, was just getting started. The death of Jezebel was merely the opening act in a brutal campaign to secure his throne and eradicate the house of Ahab. Like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into still water, the aftershocks of Jezebel's fall were about to touch lives throughout the kingdom. Jehu sent letters to Samaria, where 70 sons of Ahab lived under the care of the city's elders. His message was wrapped in false options. Choose the best and fittest of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. It was a trap, and the elders of Samaria knew it. They had seen what happened to Joram and Jezebel. They replied with submission, "We are your servants, and will do all that you ask us. We will not make any man king. Do as you wish." Jehu's second letter revealed his true intentions. "If you are on my side, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me at Jezreel by tomorrow at this time." The next day, 70 baskets arrived at Jezreel gates, each containing the head of one of Ahab's descendants. Jehu ordered them stacked in 2 piles at the city entrance, a gruesome warning to anyone who might challenge his right to rule. But the bloodshed was just beginning. Next, Jehu eliminated all who remained of Ahab's family in Jezreel: officials, close friends, priests, anyone connected to the previous dynasty. He then journeyed to Samaria, continuing his purge along the way. At Beth-eked of the shepherds, he encountered 42 members of Judah's royal family, relatives of the slain king Ahaziah. Though they had no part in Jezebel's crimes, they shared blood ties to Ahab through marriage alliances. None survived the meeting. Continuing towards Samaria, Jehu met Jehonadab, son of Rechab, a religious purist known for his strict adherence to ancient traditions and rejection of urban luxuries. Seeing a chance to add religious legitimacy to his purge, Jehu invited him into his chariot. "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." With Jehonadab beside him, providing a veneer of holy approval, Jehu entered Samaria and finished killing all who remained of Ahab's extended family. The biblical text describes it with chilling finality. He destroyed Ahab in Samaria according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. But Jehu saved his most theatrical violence for the worshippers of Baal, Jezebel's religious legacy. He announced a grand sacrifice to Baal, larger than anything Ahab had ever offered. Worshippers came from throughout Israel, filling Baal's temple to capacity. Once they were all inside, Jehu stationed 80 men around the temple with clear instructions. "If anyone escapes whom I deliver into your hands, it will be your life for his life." The sacrifice never took place. Instead, Jehu's men entered the temple and killed every worshipper. They dragged out the sacred pillars and burned them. They tore down the temple itself and turned it into a latrine, the ultimate desecration. In a single coordinated campaign, Jehu had eliminated both the dynastic and religious legacy of Jezebel. The Omride dynasty that had ruled Israel for decades was gone. The Baal worship that Jezebel had established was driven underground. The temples she had built were ruins. The biblical writers approved of Jehu's religious reforms while remaining silent on his methods. The authors of Kings report that God told Jehu, "Because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." Yet later prophets like Hosea would condemn the bloodshed of Jezreel, suggesting that even divine purpose did not fully justify Jehu's excessive violence. The aftershocks of Jezebel's fall had turned into a political earthquake, leaving Israel's landscape forever changed. Jezebel through the prophets. Long after the dogs finished their grim feast in Jezreel's streets, Jezebel lived on in Israel's memory. The prophets who followed Elijah and Elisha kept her story alive, not just as historical record, but as a powerful symbol. Through their writings, Jezebel transcended her death to become something larger, a cautionary tale, a spiritual archetype, a name that carried weight beyond the woman herself. The prophet Hosea, writing roughly a century after Jezebel's death, referenced the bloodshed of Jezreel when pronouncing judgment on Jehu's dynasty. Though he never mentioned Jezebel by name, his words kept the memory of that bloody chapter alive for new generations. In the writings of Jeremiah, false prophets are condemned using imagery that would remind listeners of Jezebel's religious practices. Though unnamed, her shadow falls across these passages. When Jeremiah speaks of those who prophesy by Baal and lead my people astray, the echo of Jezebel's imported priests and prophets would have been clear to his audience. The prophet Ezekiel used some of his most vivid language to condemn religious infidelity, often using feminine imagery that recalled Jezebel's story. When he spoke of Israel playing the whore with foreign gods, the people would remember the foreign queen who brought Baal worship into their midst. But it was in the much later book of Revelation that Jezebel made her most explicit prophetic appearance. In a letter to the church at Thyatira, the risen Christ condemns that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. This wasn't the historical Jezebel, who had been dead for nearly 1,000 years when Revelation was written. Rather, it was someone in the early Christian community whose teachings were seen as similarly corrupting. By invoking Jezebel's name, the author tapped into centuries of accumulated meaning, foreign influence, false teaching, seduction away from true faith. Through the prophets, Jezebel became more than a failed queen. She became a symbol of religious corruption, of the dangers of foreign influence, of feminine wiles used to lead the faithful astray. Her name became shorthand for a particular kind of spiritual danger that the biblical writers warned against repeatedly. Whether this characterization was fair to the historical woman is another question. The prophets weren't writing objective history. They were crafting spiritual narrative with clear lessons for their communities. Jezebel served their purposes as the perfect antagonist, powerful, foreign, feminine, and devoted to gods they rejected. Yet even in the prophetic literature, traces of Jezebel's strength shine through. She is never portrayed as weak or ineffective. She is dangerous precisely because she is capable, determined, and influential. The prophets feared and condemned her because she nearly succeeded in changing Israel's religious landscape permanently. In the prophetic imagination, Jezebel became larger than life. She represented not just one woman's actions, but a pattern they warned against: the seductive pull of foreign ways, the corrupting influence of power divorced from proper worship, the danger of forgetting one's spiritual heritage. This prophetic afterlife ensured that Jezebel would never be forgotten. Long after her contemporaries faded from memory, her name continued to evoke strong reactions. The prophets had transformed a Sidonian princess into an eternal symbol, ensuring that as long as their texts were read, Jezebel would live on. Was Jezebel a feminist icon? Under starlit desert skies, ancient stories take on new meanings with each retelling. As modern eyes look back across 3 millennia to the figure of Jezebel, something curious happens. The villain of the biblical narrative sometimes transforms into something else entirely: a feminist icon, a misunderstood powerful woman, a victim of patriarchal propaganda. Is there truth in this dramatic reinterpretation? The answer isn't simple. Jezebel certainly displayed qualities that modern feminists might admire. She was assertive in a world where women rarely held direct power. She maintained her cultural and religious identity rather than submitting to her adopted country's traditions. She wielded real political authority, not just ceremonial status. When facing death, she met it with dignity and defiance rather than pleading or running. These qualities, independence, cultural integrity, political acumen, and courage, resonate with contemporary values about female empowerment. Some modern readers see in Jezebel a woman who refused to be sidelined, who carved out space for herself in a world designed to limit her. Yet, embracing Jezebel as a straightforward feminist hero requires overlooking the darker aspects of her biblical portrayal. The text accuses her of orchestrating Naboth's judicial murder to satisfy her husband's land envy. It describes her violent persecution of Yahweh's prophets. It portrays her as introducing religious practices that, according to biblical standards, corrupted Israel. A more nuanced feminist reading might acknowledge these negative portrayals while questioning the reliability of the narrative itself. After all, Jezebel's story comes to us through writers who opposed everything she stood for religiously and politically. They had every reason to paint her in the darkest possible colors. What would Jezebel's reign look like if told from a Sidonian perspective? What if we had accounts from female courtiers who served her, or from those who worshipped at the temples she built? These voices are forever lost to us, leaving a one-sided portrait drawn by her enemies. Some scholars have noted that the biblical text's focus on Jezebel's cosmetics and sexuality in her death scene reveals ancient biases. Would a male ruler's final moments be described with attention to his appearance? Or would the focus be solely on his political and military legacy? Perhaps the most balanced view sees Jezebel neither as villain nor hero, but as a complex woman navigating challenging circumstances. Born a princess in coastal Phoenicia, she was sent to a less sophisticated, more religiously rigid kingdom for political purposes. She brought her cultural heritage with her, including religious practices that horrified her new country's religious establishment. Rather than quietly adapting, she sought to transform her new home. This choice, whether brave or foolish, set her on a collision course with powerful religious forces. The prophetic movement led by Elijah represented a form of religious purity that left no room for Jezebel's inclusive Baal worship. Modern feminist interpretation doesn't need to rehabilitate Jezebel as flawless to find value in her story. Perhaps what's most feminist is simply recognizing her as a fully human actor in her historical drama, neither demoness nor saint, but a woman making choices within the constraints and opportunities of her time. Her story reminds us that women have always found ways to exercise power, even in apparently restrictive societies. It shows that ancient texts often reveal as much about their authors' biases as about their subjects. And it demonstrates how religious conflicts often become the lens through which history judges controversial figures. Jezebel as feminist icon? Perhaps not entirely. But Jezebel as a woman worth understanding on her own terms beyond the caricature her enemies created? Absolutely. The politics of idolatry, gentle whispers of wind through cedar trees, the soft glow of oil lamps illuminating stone pillars, the sweet scent of incense rising toward carved wooden ceilings. This was the world of Baal worship, not the demonic orgy often imagined, but a sophisticated religious tradition with centuries of development behind it. To understand Jezebel fully, we must look beyond biblical condemnation to see what her religious practices actually entailed. Archaeological discoveries have given us a more nuanced picture of Phoenician religion than the biblical writers provided. Baal, whose name simply meant Lord or Master, was a storm and fertility god. In agricultural societies dependent on rainfall for crops, his worship was hardly surprising. Statues and carvings show him holding a lightning bolt or spear, symbols of his power over life-giving storms. His consort Asherah, also mentioned in biblical texts, was associated with fertility and motherhood. These deities weren't uniquely Phoenician. Various forms of Baal worship existed throughout the ancient Near East. Even in Israel, archaeological evidence suggests that many ordinary people practiced a blended religion that incorporated elements of Baal worship alongside Yahweh devotion. Religious boundaries were often more fluid than biblical texts suggest. What made Jezebel's version of these practices so threatening wasn't necessarily their content, but their context. She wasn't just practicing personal devotion, she was implementing state-sponsored religious change. She built temples using royal resources. She supported hundreds of prophets and priests from the palace treasury. She elevated her gods to national prominence. This wasn't merely religious, it was deeply political. In ancient Near Eastern understanding, gods and kingship were inseparably linked. Kings ruled by divine favor. Temple and palace functioned as twin centers of power. By changing Israel's religious landscape, Jezebel was also reshaping its political foundations. For the Yahwistic prophets like Elijah, this represented an existential threat. Their understanding of Israel's identity centered on exclusive devotion to Yahweh. Their conception of kingship rested on the monarch's submission to divine law rather than divine embodiment. Jezebel's religious innovations undermined these fundamental beliefs. The conflict between Jezebel and Elijah wasn't simply theological debate. It was a struggle for Israel's soul and future. Would the northern kingdom maintain its distinctive religious identity, or would it be absorbed into the broader religious patterns of its neighbors? Would its monarchy follow the model of other Near Eastern divine kingships, or would it remain accountable to prophetic voices claiming to speak for Yahweh? Archaeological findings at Samaria reveal the material reality of Jezebel's reign. Ivory carvings showing Egyptian and Phoenician motifs, distinctive pottery with Phoenician designs, the remnants of monumental architecture with Sidonian influences. These artifacts confirm the biblical picture of a court embracing foreign cultural elements. But was Jezebel a religious zealot bent on destroying Yahweh worship, as the biblical narrative suggests? Or was she a cultural bridge builder trying to integrate Israel into the broader Mediterranean world? The answer likely lies somewhere between these extremes. As a Sidonian princess, Jezebel would have been raised in a cosmopolitan trading center accustomed to religious plurality. Phoenician cities welcomed merchants from across the Mediterranean, each bringing their own gods and practices. From this perspective, adding Baal and Asherah to Israel's religious landscape might have seemed like sensible cultural diplomacy rather than aggressive conversion. However, Israel's prophetic tradition had long resisted such religious accommodation. From Moses onward, prophetic voices had insisted on exclusive devotion to Yahweh. What appeared to Jezebel as harmless religious addition looked to them like dangerous dilution. The politics of idolatry in Jezebel's time reveals something important about religious conflicts throughout history. Often, what appears as theological disagreement masks deeper questions about cultural identity, political authority, and social organization. Jezebel's Baal worship threatened not just Israel's religion, but its understanding of itself as a people set apart. In the end, the prophets won this particular battle. Jehu's purge eliminated official Baal worship in Israel. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests that popular religious practice remained blended long afterward. The tension between official orthodoxy and lived religious experience continued, a pattern that would repeat throughout religious history. Women in power in the ancient Near East. The fading sun cast long shadows across the painted walls of royal chambers in Memphis, Hattusha, Nineveh, and Tyre. In these ancient capitals, women moved through corridors of influence, finding paths to power in societies seemingly designed to exclude them. Jezebel wasn't an anomaly in the ancient world. She was part of a long tradition of female rulers who shaped history from behind thrones, or occasionally while sitting upon them. In Egypt, women like Hatshepsut didn't just influence kings, they became kings, ruling not as queens but as female pharaohs. Hatshepsut adopted male royal imagery, even wearing the false beard of kingship in official depictions. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands as testament to her 20-year reign, nearly a millennium before Jezebel's time. Closer to Jezebel's era, the Assyrian queen Shamaaramat, known to Greeks as Semiramis, ruled as regent for her son and led military campaigns. Archaeological evidence confirms her unusual status. Her name appears on inscriptions normally reserved for kings. Like Jezebel, legends about her grew more elaborate over time, transforming a historical queen into a mythic figure. In Hittite civilization, the queen held the title Tawananna and maintained her position even after her husband's death, serving alongside the new king. These women conducted diplomatic correspondence with other royal houses and performed crucial religious functions as chief priestesses. Against this backdrop, Jezebel's power appears less exceptional. As daughter of Ethbal, king of Sidon and priest of Astarte, she would have observed the interconnection of political and religious authority from childhood. When she married into Israel's royal house, she brought these expectations with her. The Mediterranean world Jezebel knew was experiencing what historians call the Orientalizing period, an era of increased cultural exchange between East and West. Trade networks carried not just goods, but ideas across boundaries. Royal women often moved between courts as diplomatic marriages cemented political alliances. These foreign princesses like Jezebel brought their cultural and religious practices with them. The biblical writers viewed Jezebel's influence through a particular lens, seeing her power as corrupting rather than culturally normal. Yet her methods, patronage of religious officials, court appointments, strategic marriage alliances for her children, were standard tactics for royal women throughout the region. What made Jezebel unusual wasn't her exercise of power, but the context in which she wielded it. Israel's religious and political tradition differed from neighboring kingdoms. Prophets like Elijah claimed divine authority separate from and sometimes opposed to royal power. This created tension when Jezebel applied familiar Phoenician patterns of queenship to Israel's unique setting. After Jezebel's death, her daughter Athaliah continued the family tradition of female power. When her son King Ahaziah of Judah died, Athaliah seized the throne for herself, ruling Judah for 6 years. Like her mother, she met a violent end when priests orchestrated a coup to install her grandson Joash as king. These mother-daughter rulers demonstrate how women could create spaces for female authority, even within patriarchal systems. They used religious patronage, control over the royal household, strategic marriages, and careful cultivation of allies to build networks of influence that sometimes rivaled or exceeded those of the kings they married. Archaeological evidence from across the ancient Near East reveals that royal women controlled their own households, managed significant property, conducted business, and sometimes administered regions or cities. Seals bearing queens' names have been found, showing they had authority to conduct official business. Jezebel's story, seen within this wider context, becomes less about one woman's exceptional ambition and more about the predictable tensions that arose when different models of female royal power collided with Israel's distinctive religious traditions. The biblical writers portrayed Jezebel as a dangerous aberration, but in many ways, she was applying cultural templates that would have seemed normal to her Phoenician eyes. Her tragedy wasn't that she sought power. It was that she failed to adapt her understanding of queenship to the unique prophetic environment of Israel. Centuries after her death, her name would become synonymous with dangerous female influence. Yet in her time, she was following well-established paths of queenly authority. The ancient Near East had many powerful women whose stories history has dimmed. Jezebel's endures not because she was unique, but because her enemies wrote her story so vividly. Jezebel in Jewish tradition. Stars twinkle above ancient synagogues, where for centuries rabbis and teachers have unfolded Torah scrolls and explored their meanings. In these houses of study, Jezebel's story continued to grow and evolve long after her death. Jewish tradition found in her a powerful symbol and a useful warning, a woman whose story could teach important lessons about faith, culture, and proper conduct. The earliest post-biblical Jewish interpretations of Jezebel appear in the Talmud, that vast collection of rabbinic discussions compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE. Here, the rabbis fill gaps in the biblical narrative, exploring questions the text leaves unanswered. One famous Talmudic passage examines why Jezebel merited such a terrible death. The rabbis, always looking for measure justice in biblical stories, suggest that her gruesome end, being eaten by dogs, corresponded to specific sins. According to one opinion, she would dance and entice young men with jingling bells, like the bells worn by temple dancers. This interpretation transformed the political and religious conflict of the biblical account into a story about sexual impropriety. Another rabbinic tradition focuses on Jezebel's name itself. In Hebrew, Jezebel contains the roots for both where, I, and dung, zevel. Rabbinic wordplay suggested her name predicted her fate. She would become like dung scattered in a field, as the prophet had foretold. The medieval Jewish commentators continued developing Jezebel's image. Rashi, the great 11th century French commentator, noted that when the Bible says Jezebel painted her eyes, the Hebrew term suggests she did so to enhance her beauty, implying vanity even in her final moments. Yet other commentators saw her final actions differently, suggesting she adorned herself not from vanity, but to die with dignity, as befitted her royal status. In the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, Jezebel sometimes appears as a symbol of the Sitra Achra, the other side, or forces of spiritual impurity. Her foreign gods and persecution of prophets made her a perfect embodiment of opposition to holiness. Jewish ethical literature, Musar, used Jezebel as an example of how power without proper spiritual guidance leads to corruption. These texts often contrasted her with virtuous biblical women like Sarah, Rebecca, or Esther, who used their influence for the benefit of their people rather than against divine will. Perhaps most interesting is how Jewish tradition maintained a certain ambivalence about Jezebel. While never rehabilitating her character, rabbinic sources occasionally acknowledged her positive qualities. The Talmud notes that one reason Ahab merited 22 years of kingship was because he honored the Torah, which contained 22 letters, by respecting his wife. Even while condemning Jezebel's actions, this tradition recognized that a husband honoring his wife was praiseworthy. Some midrashic traditions suggest that Jezebel's loyalty to her religious traditions, though misguided, demonstrated a certain integrity. She remained true to the faith of her childhood, rather than adopting her husband's religion for political convenience. This consistency, though directed toward false gods in the rabbinic view, contained a seed of admirable faithfulness. Hasidic teachers occasionally found deeper lessons in Jezebel's story. One interpretation suggested that her name, containing the word zevel, dwelling, hinted at how even the lowest spiritual states could become dwellings for divine presence through proper teshuvah, repentance. Though Jezebel herself didn't repent in the biblical account, her story could inspire others to transform their spiritual failures. As Jewish communities faced their own experiences with persecution and pressures to assimilate, Jezebel's story took on new dimensions. In medieval and early modern Europe, Jewish commentators sometimes saw parallels between Jezebel's foreign religious practices and the temptations their communities faced to abandon tradition for surrounding cultures. For Jewish women through the centuries, Jezebel represented a warning about using influence improperly. Yet, as women's roles evolved in modern Jewish movements, some began to question whether Jezebel's portrayal reflected genuine moral failings or simply male discomfort with female authority. Contemporary feminist Jewish scholars have examined how gender affected the biblical and rabbinic portrayal of Jezebel, seeking to separate historical reality from gendered narrative. Throughout these varied interpretations, Jewish tradition maintained Jezebel as a complex figure, never simply dismissed, always worth examining for deeper meaning. Her story became a mirror in which each generation could explore its own questions about assimilation, religious integrity, the proper use of power, and the complex role of women in religious communities. In synagogues and study houses, as Torah scrolls were unrolled to the stories of Israel's kings, Jezebel's name continued to evoke strong responses, a testament to her enduring power as a symbol in Jewish religious imagination. Jezebel in Christian imagination. The name Jezebel echoes through Christian history like a warning bell. In the book of Revelation, written centuries after her death, she transforms from flesh and blood into something more haunting. The author mentions a prophetess who calls herself Jezebel, teaching and leading followers astray. With this single reference, her name leaps from history into spiritual metaphor. Medieval Christians didn't just remember Jezebel, they feared what she stood for. Monks copying manuscripts would sometimes pause at her name, making the sign of the cross before continuing. In their eyes, she wasn't just a queen who died long ago, but a lurking presence, a spiritual threat that could manifest in any woman who stepped beyond her place. By the time of the witch trials in Europe, Jezebel had become shorthand for women who challenged authority. Preachers would invoke her name from pulpits, describing her painted face and haughty stare as warnings of female vanity and rebellion. A woman too bold, too outspoken, might find herself compared to this ancient queen, with all the danger such comparison carried. Protestant reformers found new uses for Jezebel's story. When Martin Luther railed against the Catholic Church, he called the papacy worse than any Jezebel. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, wrote his famous tract, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, targeting Mary Queen of Scots by comparing her to the Phoenician queen who led Israel astray. The concept of a Jezebel spirit bloomed in the soil of American revivalist movements. Preachers describe this spirit as one that seeks to emasculate men, particularly those in positions of spiritual authority. They warned congregations to watch for signs, dominance, manipulation, seduction, all wrapped up in the image of a painted queen at her window. Camp meetings across America's frontier would feature fiery sermons about Jezebel's influence hiding in plain sight. Women who wore too much jewelry or spoke too confidently might be pulled aside for gentle correction. The fear wasn't just of female power, but something deeper. The fear that true faith could be undermined from within by subtle corruption. Modern evangelical literature continues this tradition with books about overcoming the Jezebel spirit, filling church bookstore shelves. These works often blend the biblical account with concepts from spiritual warfare, creating a Jezebel far more supernatural than the woman described in Kings. She becomes less a historical figure and more a spiritual archetype, the feminine face of rebellion against divine order. In Christian art through centuries, Jezebel appears at her window, forever frozen in that final moment before her fall. Medieval illuminated manuscripts show her tiny and distant, while Renaissance painters luxuriate in the moral contrast, her beauty and finery juxtaposed with the violence about to unfold. Her painted face becomes a mask that Christianity warns hides darkness beneath. Contemporary Christian films and novels still draw on Jezebel for dramatic tension. They place her in opposition to Elijah, creating a battle between feminine wiles and masculine prophecy, between human scheming and divine truth. These modern retellings often simplify the political complexity of her time, focusing instead on the moral lesson her downfall provides. Yet even within Christianity, new voices are emerging to question this tradition. Female theologians have begun re-examining Jezebel's story, asking how much of her villainy stems from the fact that her tale was recorded by her enemies. They wonder what parts of her story might read differently if told through her eyes, rather than through the lens of those who celebrated her destruction. Jezebel in Islam and the Quran. Unlike many biblical figures who appear in Islamic texts, Jezebel is notably absent from the Quran. This silence speaks volumes. Where characters like Solomon, David, and Moses bridge the traditions, Jezebel remains exclusively in Jewish and Christian narratives. Her story finds no home in Islamic scripture. This absence creates a fascinating void. While Islamic tradition honors many prophets shared with Judaism and Christianity, it makes no mention of Elijah's confrontation with Jezebel. The dramatic showdown at Mount Carmel, central to the biblical account, disappears entirely. When Islam tells of Elijah, Ilyas in Arabic, it focuses on his calling people back to worship of the one true God, without naming his royal adversary. Had Jezebel appeared in Islamic texts, she might have joined other women known for opposing prophets, like the wife of Pharaoh who rejected Moses, or Abu Lahab's wife who scattered thorns in Muhammad's path. Instead, she remains unknown to traditional Islamic teaching. When Muslim scholars discuss biblical stories not included in the Quran, they often explain these omissions as corrections to corrupted narratives, or simply as divine wisdom in selecting which stories best serve faith. Though unnamed in Scripture, echoes of her archetypal role, the powerful woman opposing God's message, do appear in Islamic folk traditions. Stories warn of women using beauty and influence to lead men from righteous paths. These cautionary tales share thematic connections with Jezebel's story without directly borrowing from it. In regions where Christianity and Islam have long existed side by side, cultural osmosis has sometimes brought knowledge of Jezebel into Muslim communities. Parts of Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt have folk traditions that reference her, blending with local stories and losing their biblical specificity along the way. She becomes simply a queen who defied God and met a terrible end. Modern Muslim historians approaching the Bible critically sometimes mention Jezebel when discussing the northern kingdom of Israel. They treat her as a historical figure rather than a spiritual example, noting the political complexities of her era and the clash of cultures her marriage to Ahab represented. These scholarly works view her through a lens of historical analysis rather than moral judgment. The absence of Jezebel from Islamic tradition creates an interesting comparison point between religions. Where Christianity transformed her into an ongoing spiritual threat, a timeless temptress, Islam simply left her behind. This difference highlights how traditions select and amplify certain narratives while allowing others to fade from collective memory. For Muslims living in Western countries today, Jezebel often represents an unfamiliar reference point in their Christian neighbors' vocabulary. When they encounter the term used as shorthand for a manipulative or overly sexual woman, the biblical context may be entirely unknown to them. The name carries no weight, no history, no meaning, a stark contrast to its loaded significance in Christian discourse. This absence also means Muslim women have been spared one particular avenue of religious criticism. No Muslim woman, no matter how powerful or controversial, has had to bear comparison to Jezebel. The name cannot be wielded as a weapon against them, as it has been against women in Christian contexts for centuries. Perhaps most intriguing is how this illustrates the selective nature of sacred memory. Three faiths sharing many of the same stories and figures can diverge so completely on others. Jezebel, central enough to warrant dozens of verses in the Hebrew Bible, commanding enough to challenge prophets and kings, simply vanishes from the spiritual landscape as one crosses from Christian tradition into Islamic understanding. Archaeology of Samaria and Jezreel. The spade reveals what texts conceal. When archaeologists first broke ground at ancient Samaria in the early 1900s, they weren't just digging for pottery, they were searching for Jezebel's world. What they found transformed her from a villain in ancient texts to a woman who walked real streets and dwelled in real palaces whose foundations still stand. Samaria sits on a hill overlooking fertile valleys. Its natural defensibility made it an ideal capital, and excavations revealed massive stone walls dating to the time of Omri and Ahab, Jezebel's father-in-law and husband. These weren't crude fortifications, but sophisticated constructions using ashlar masonry, smoothly carved stone blocks that speak of wealth and technological skill. The biblical writer who noted that Ahab built an ivory house wasn't exaggerating. Indeed, among the most stunning finds were delicate ivory pieces, hundreds of them, decorating furniture and walls in the palace area. These ivories show distinct Phoenician craftsmanship with Egyptian motifs, lotus flowers, sphinxes, and royal figures seated on thrones. Many believe Jezebel brought these artistic influences with her from Tyre. Your fingers could trace the same curves and patterns that her eyes once admired. A stone seal discovered in Israel bears the name YZBL, quite possibly Jezebel's own seal for official documents. Its existence confirms something often overlooked. She functioned as a proper queen with administrative duties, not merely as the biblical villain. The seal shows Egyptian influence in its design, again pointing to the cosmopolitan nature of her court. The archaeological layers tell a story of prosperity during Ahab and Jezebel's reign. Imported goods, Cyprian pottery, Egyptian scarabs, luxury items from across the Mediterranean show a kingdom engaged in thriving trade networks. Far from leading Israel to ruin, the material evidence suggests their reign saw economic flourishing and cultural exchange. At Jezreel, where Jezebel met her end, excavations revealed an enormous rectangular enclosure with massive corner towers. This royal compound matches the biblical description of a secondary palace where the royal couple sometimes resided. Standing at the excavated gate, you can almost picture Jehu's chariot approaching and Jezebel at her window above. The religious conflict central to Jezebel's story leaves traces in the ground as well. Archaeologists have uncovered small female figurines, possibly representations of Asherah, the goddess often worshipped alongside Baal. These were found not just in royal contexts, but in ordinary houses, suggesting that the religious practices Jezebel promoted had already found fertile ground among the population. Stone altars with corners matching the biblical description of Baal worship sites have been excavated. Some show signs of deliberate destruction, possibly during religious reforms that followed Jezebel's death. These broken stones silently testify to the violent religious swings the population endured as royal policy shifted. Water systems from this period show remarkable engineering. Deep shafts cut through bedrock to reach springs below cities, protecting water supplies during siege. The impressive waterworks at Megiddo and Hazor likely mirrored those in Samaria, demonstrating that whatever her religious policies, Jezebel's kingdom invested in critical infrastructure. Climate studies of the region have identified evidence of a severe drought during the 9th century BCE, precisely when the Bible places Elijah's contest with Baal's prophets over which deity could end the drought. This scientific confirmation of a climate crisis adds credibility to the biblical account, suggesting it preserves memory of real events, however theologically interpreted. No archaeological evidence directly confirms the more lurid details of Jezebel's death. No dog bones gathered at a particular spot in Jezreel, no bloodstains on ancient stones. Yet the spatial layout of the excavated palace aligns with the biblical description of her defenestration. The physical setting makes the story plausible in ways pure fiction might not be. Perhaps most significantly, archaeology reveals what texts only hint at. Jezebel lived in a multicultural kingdom where Israelite traditions blended with Phoenician, Egyptian, and Canaanite influences. The material culture shows not rigid boundaries between belief systems, but a fluid interchange of ideas, art, and practices. This context helps explain why her introduction of Phoenician worship wasn't as foreign or shocking as biblical writers later portrayed it. When you hold artifacts from her time, a pottery shard, a stone weight, a fragment of carved ivory, you touch her world. These objects bridge millennia, connecting us to a queen who was never allowed to tell her own story, but whose presence remains embedded in the very soil of Israel. The name that echoed her name became a knife, sharpened through centuries and pressed against the throats of countless women. Jezebel, once simply what they called a Phoenician princess, transformed into one of history's most potent insults. Few names have traveled so far from their origins or cut so deeply when spoken. In colonial America, white slave owners twisted Jezebel's story into a racial weapon. They labeled enslaved black women as Jezebels, inherently seductive and morally corrupt. This deliberately crafted stereotype painted victims as tempters, justifying sexual violence by blaming those who suffered it. The cruel irony, Jezebel, a powerful queen, became a tool to further disempower society's most vulnerable. The Jezebel stereotype poisoned American race relations for generations. It allowed white society to view black women as inherently different, more sexual, less virtuous, unworthy of the protection afforded white women. In courtrooms, a black woman claiming sexual assault might hear whispers of Jezebel, her very humanity questioned through association with an ancient queen she'd never worshipped. Meanwhile, suffragists fighting for women's right to vote found themselves compared to Jezebel by opponents. Political cartoons showed them with painted faces and haughty expressions, deliberately echoing the biblical queen's final moments. The message rang clear. Women seeking political power would end like she did, rejected, destroyed, forgotten except as cautionary tales. During the temperance movement, women advocating against alcohol were both compared to Jezebel and wielded her name against fallen women. The bitter irony went unnoticed. Those using her name as a weapon were themselves being branded with it by others. The Queen's name became a circular firing squad in America's culture wars. The sexual revolution of the 1960s saw conservative religious voices revive Jezebel rhetoric with fresh energy. Women wearing miniskirts or advocating for reproductive rights were labeled modern Jezebels, supposedly leading society toward moral collapse, just as the ancient queen had led Israel toward Baal worship. Her name became shorthand for any feminine challenge to traditional authority. Even in contemporary workplaces, echoes of this ancient insult linger. A woman described as ambitious often faces whispers suggesting manipulation and scheming, Jezebel's supposed traits. Professional assertiveness in women still triggers associations with the painted queen at her window, using charm and calculation rather than merit and skill. The music and entertainment industry embraced and sometimes reclaimed the Jezebel archetype. Blues singers incorporated her into lyrics, sometimes identifying with her power, sometimes warning against women like her. When Frankie Lane sang Jezebel in 1951, Jezebel, Jezebel, if ever the devil was born without a pair of horns, it was you, Jezebel, it was you. He cemented her place in popular culture as the ultimate dangerous woman. In a strange twist of linguistic fate, some African American communities reclaimed Jezebel as a term of empowerment, a woman too strong, too sexual, too self-determined for society's comfort. This reclamation follows a pattern seen with other slurs, attempting to drain the poison from a word by claiming ownership of it. The ancient queen might have appreciated this defiant response to her tarnished legacy. The internet age spawned websites like Jezebel.com, consciously adopting the name to signal feminist commentary unafraid of challenging patriarchal norms. This modern usage attempts to rehabilitate the name, suggesting that history's Jezebels might simply have been women who refused to know their place, a trait now celebrated rather than condemned. Today, when someone calls a woman Jezebel, they rarely think of 9th century BCE Israelite politics or Phoenician religious practices. They invoke centuries of accumulated meaning, female sexuality as dangerous, female ambition as manipulative, female power as inherently corrupt. Few using the name could tell you about the actual queen who lived and died in ancient Samaria. Yet they wield the weight of her name, often unaware of the burden it carries. Jezebel in art and literature. Artists across centuries couldn't resist her story. Jezebel's dramatic life and death offered everything they craved: beauty, power, violence, and divine retribution wrapped in exotic settings. On canvas after canvas, they reimagined her, each generation projecting its own fears and fascinations onto this ancient queen. Medieval manuscript illuminators typically showed her small and stylized, a crowned figure tumbling from a window while dogs wait below. These simple illustrations served as warnings rather than portraits, moral footnotes about the wages of sin. The artists cared little for historical accuracy. Jezebel wears medieval European clothing, her Phoenician origins entirely forgotten. Renaissance painters transformed her completely. In their hands, she became voluptuous and pale-skinned, draped in sumptuous fabrics that barely contained her form. Gustave Moreau's famous 1865 painting shows her as an exotic temptress surrounded by ivory and gold, her death approaching but her beauty untouched. These artists weren't illustrating biblical history but creating sensual fantasies draped in religious respectability. The Pre-Raphaelites found in Jezebel a perfect subject, beautiful, doomed, morally complex. John Byam Liston Shaw's 1896 Jezebel depicts her final moments with theatrical intensity. She stands proud in royal purple while servants prepare her for death. The painting captures something often missed in simpler tellings: her dignity and defiance in the face of inevitable destruction. Theatrical presentations took even greater liberties. When playwright John Racine wrote Athalie in 1691, he focused on Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, but his portrait of the mother's lingering influence carried all the horror European audiences associated with her name. The play's success helped cement Jezebel's reputation as the ultimate wicked queen in Western imagination. Opera found in Jezebel a natural subject. High drama, powerful emotions, and spectacular death scenes provided everything composers desired. Yet, strangely, few major operas centered directly on her story. Instead, she appears in references and comparisons, her name invoked whenever librettists needed shorthand for feminine evil. This absence as a protagonist speaks to something uncomfortable about her story. Perhaps she remained too powerful, too autonomous for comfortable consumption. Literary treatments proved more varied and nuanced. When Marcel Proust mentioned her in Search of Lost Time, he used her as a symbol of how society transforms human beings into simplistic archetypes. Herman Melville made similar use of her in Moby Dick, showing how names carry histories that shape our perception far beyond rational thought. Modern novels have attempted more sympathetic portraits. Eleanor de Jong's 1956 Jezebel was among the first to imagine the story from the Queen's perspective, suggesting she simply followed her culture's traditions in a foreign land. More recent fictional accounts like The Witch of Jezebel by Theda Kenyon or Jezebel, The Untold Story by Leslie Hazelton explicitly position themselves as correctives to centuries of one-sided portrayals. Contemporary art has found new resonance in her story. Feminist artists reference Jezebel when exploring how powerful women face demonization. Photographer Renee Cox's controversial work, Yo Mama's Last Supper, doesn't directly depict Jezebel, but engages with similar themes of how female bodies become battlegrounds for religious and cultural conflicts. The literary journal Jezebel's Daughter began publishing women's writing in 2010, explicitly seeking to reclaim her legacy as a woman whose story was written by her enemies. Their manifesto states, "For too long, Jezebel has been a name hurled at women who refuse silence. We name ourselves after her in solidarity with all whose stories have been twisted to serve others' purposes." Children's Bible illustrations continue the tradition of simplifying her into a straightforward villain: painted face, haughty expression, jewels signifying vanity. These images, seen by children before they can critically evaluate sources, ensure each new generation absorbs the traditional view before encountering any revisionist perspective. Theatrical productions increasingly explore nuance in her character. A 2018 off-Broadway play titled Painted imagined Jezebel's inner thoughts as she applied makeup for her final confrontation, exploring themes of performance, power, and facing death on one's own terms. The one-woman show received critical acclaim for humanizing a figure long reduced to caricature. Perhaps most telling is how visual depictions of Jezebel reflect their era's standards of beauty rather than historical accuracy. From pale Renaissance ideals to exotic Orientalist fantasies to modern diverse representations, artists reveal more about themselves than about the actual Phoenician queen. She becomes a mirror reflecting each society's attitudes toward female power, foreign influence, and moral authority. In every brushstroke and written word about Jezebel, artists reveal the endless human fascination with women who defy boundaries. Though her body was consumed by dogs, her image has been repeatedly resurrected, reinvented, and reimagined, proof that a powerful woman, even one reviled in sacred texts, never truly disappears from cultural memory. Jezebel in pop culture. Her name sells magazines. In 1957, Jezebel appeared on newsstands, a publication featuring pin-ups and racy stories that would seem tame today but shocked conservative America. The publishers knew exactly what they were doing. 3,000 years after her death, Jezebel still signified forbidden sexuality and dangerous allure. Music couldn't resist her powerful symbolism. When Frankie Lane's Jezebel topped charts in 1951, listeners thrilled to lyrics describing a woman born with a heart of stone. The song's popularity spawned cover versions across genres, from Edith Piaf's passionate French interpretation to Shirley Bassey's dramatic delivery. Each singer found something different in the ancient queen's story. Iron and Wine's haunting 2005 song Jezebel took a gentler approach. Who's seen Jezebel? She was born to be the woman we could blame. Make me a beast half as brave, I'd be the same. These lyrics hint at something deeper, how convenient it is to have female villains who carry our cultural shadows, allowing others to appear more righteous by comparison. Hollywood discovered Jezebel's dramatic potential early. The 1938 film Jezebel, starring Bette Davis, doesn't actually retell the biblical story. Instead, it features a headstrong Southern belle whose behavior echoes the ancient queen's defiance of social norms. The title alone conveyed everything audiences needed to know about the protagonist's character. Television references scatter throughout decades of programming. When a manipulative female character appears on crime shows or soap operas, other characters often mutter Jezebel under their breath. The writers rely on audiences understanding this shorthand. No explanation needed for one of culture's most enduring insults. Comic books and graphic novels have occasionally reimagined her story. In one notable example, Neil Gaiman's Sandman series references Jezebel obliquely through characters who, like her, suffer for defying religious orthodoxy. These sophisticated treatments assume readers recognize the patterns: powerful woman, religious conflict, violent downfall. The fashion industry embraced Jezebel as shorthand for seductive, confident styling. Makeup collections, clothing lines, and perfumes have adopted her name to signal bold femininity. The bitter irony: the real Jezebel's painted face and royal robes were signs of her dignity and status, not attempts at seduction. Yet modern marketing transforms her final defiant act into mere vanity. Internet culture birthed Jezebel.com in 2007, a website offering feminist commentary on news, politics, and pop culture. Their choice of name deliberately reclaimed the term, positioning themselves as voices willing to challenge prevailing narratives. The site's popularity helped introduce younger generations to the ancient queen, often framing her as misunderstood rather than villainous. Drag performance found rich material in Jezebel's dramatic potential. Drag queens with names like Jezebel Bardot or Miss Jezebel create performances playing with themes of exaggerated femininity, power, and defiance, often with knowing winks to how society punishes women who refuse to conform. These performances transform ancient tragedy into modern empowerment. Halloween costumes labeled Sexy Jezebel appear in online stores each October, typically featuring vaguely biblical styling with heavy eye makeup and revealing cuts. These commodified versions strip away all historical context and political complexity, reducing a queen who challenged prophets and kings to aesthetic shorthand for female temptation. Romance novels frequently employ Jezebel as character description or even title. These books often feature women initially perceived as manipulative who reveal hidden depths and vulnerabilities. This narrative arc unconsciously questions the traditional view of the biblical queen, suggesting that women labeled as Jezebels might simply be misunderstood. Comedy sketches and stand-up routines reference her when discussing double standards. Men get called assertive for the same behavior that gets women called Jezebel, notes one comedian, highlighting how ancient narratives continue shaping modern gender perceptions. The laughter these jokes receive indicates audiences recognize the ongoing relevance of her story. Video games occasionally include Jezebel-inspired characters, typically sorceresses or corrupt queens who must be defeated. These digital incarnations perpetuate her role as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to understand. Players vanquish her without questioning whether history has treated her fairly. Perhaps most telling is how casually her name enters everyday speech. When someone calls a female celebrity a real Jezebel for behavior that would raise few eyebrows in a man, they unconsciously tap into centuries of gendered criticism. The ancient queen becomes a conversational weapon, her complex historical reality forgotten beneath layers of moral simplification. The enduring presence of Jezebel in popular culture, from songs to websites, fashion to films, reveals something important about collective memory. Historical figures who challenge fundamental social structures never truly die. They live on as warnings, as inspirations, as mirrors reflecting our own cultural anxieties about power, gender, and religious authority. Alternative histories. What if the dogs never came? Historians rarely ask such questions, preferring solid evidence to speculation. Yet sometimes imagining different outcomes illuminates what actually happened. If Jezebel had prevailed, if Jehu's rebellion had failed and her religious reforms had taken root, our world might look startlingly different. Had Baal worship become Israel's dominant faith, the monotheistic tradition might have developed differently, or even failed to emerge as a world-shaping force. Judaism might have evolved as a minor sect rather than a distinct religion. Without this foundation, Christianity and Islam might never have appeared. Three world religions, billions of believers across centuries, all potentially hinging on whether one queen's policies endured. Religious scholars point to a fascinating possibility. Israelite worship was likely more diverse and syncretistic than biblical texts suggest. Archaeological evidence indicates many ordinary Israelites blended Yahweh worship with veneration of other deities, including Baal and Asherah. Jezebel's policies may not have been imposing something alien, but rather officially endorsing practices already common among the population. Some historians suggest Jezebel was attempting a genuine cultural bridge, creating a multi-faith society where Phoenician and Israelite traditions could coexist. Her temples to Baal didn't necessarily require abandoning Yahweh, but offered religious plurality. This vision of tolerance failed, replaced by Jehu's violent enforcement of exclusive Yahweh worship. Marriage alliances like Jezebel's with Ahab were common diplomatic strategy. Had their partnership succeeded in creating lasting peace between Israel and Phoenicia, the northern kingdom might have withstood Assyrian pressure longer through stronger coastal alliances. Israel's fall and the consequent loss of the 10 northern tribes, a defining tragedy in Jewish history, might have been delayed or avoided. Economic historians note that Phoenician trade connections strengthened Israel's economy. Jezebel's cultural background included knowledge of Tyre's sophisticated commercial networks. Had her influence continued through her descendants, Israel might have developed stronger Mediterranean trade, becoming more cosmopolitan and less vulnerable to inland empire builders. The prophetic tradition that defines much of biblical literature emerged partly in opposition to royal policies, particularly those of Jezebel and Ahab. Had they prevailed, prophets like Elijah might be remembered as failed revolutionaries rather than spiritual heroes. The very concept of prophecy as speaking truth to power might never have gained its central religious significance. Literary scholars point out that much of the Hebrew Bible took shape during or after the Babylonian exile, centuries after Jezebel's time. Had her religious policies become normative, later editors and compilers would have viewed her reign differently. The texts describing her might praise her cosmopolitan vision rather than condemning her foreign practices. Perhaps most intriguing is considering how women's roles might have evolved differently. Phoenician culture generally afforded women higher status than ancient Israel did. Had Jezebel established lasting influence, Hebrew society might have developed different gender norms. Women's religious and political participation might have expanded rather than contracted over subsequent centuries. The very concept of idolatry, central to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, gained much of its definition through opposition to practices Jezebel supported. Without this defining struggle, monotheistic religions might have developed more visual and symbolic expressions of faith, rather than emphasizing abstraction and textuality. Our understanding of what constitutes proper worship might be unrecognizably different. Military historians note that Jehu's coup succeeded partly due to external support from Assyria, eager to weaken Israel. Had Jezebel's descendants maintained power and continued Phoenician alliances, different regional power balances might have emerged. The geopolitical map of the ancient Near East and consequently world history might have unfolded along alternative lines. Modern religious pluralism struggles with questions. Jezebel's time also faced: can multiple faith traditions coexist within one society? Who determines acceptable religious practice? What happens when state power aligns with particular beliefs? Her failed experiment in cultural integration raises questions still unresolved in contemporary multicultural societies. The violent swings between religious policies, from Yahweh exclusivity to Baal tolerance and back again, traumatized ancient Israeli society. This pattern of religious enforcement through state violence echoes throughout history. One wonders if Jezebel's approach, had it succeeded, might have established different precedents for handling religious diversity. We'll never know what might have been. Alternative histories remain speculative thought experiments, yet considering paths not taken highlights the contingent nature of what we consider inevitable. History balanced on a knife edge during Jezebel's reign. The religious landscape of our modern world, the faiths of billions, might trace back to whether one queen's vision withstood her enemies. Ahab reconsidered. We've misread him for centuries. While Jezebel commands attention with her dramatic defiance, her husband Ahab remains a shadowy figure, typically portrayed as weak-willed and dominated by his foreign wife. Yet careful reading suggests a more complex man, a canny political operator navigating dangerous waters with surprising skill. The biblical writer offers contradictory portraits. In one breath, Ahab is condemned as doing more evil than all the kings before him. In the next, we see him dialoguing respectfully with prophets, mourning when rebuked, and displaying genuine concern for his people. These inconsistencies hint at a ruler more nuanced than later interpretations allowed. Archaeological evidence from his reign tells a different story than religious texts. Under Ahab, Samaria developed sophisticated water systems, expanded fortifications, and engaged in wide-ranging trade. These achievements required leadership, vision, and administrative talent. The material record shows not a puppet king, but a capable ruler overseeing a prosperous society. His military record demonstrates strategic brilliance. When Ben-Hadad of Damascus besieged Samaria, Ahab negotiated shrewdly, then launched a surprise counterattack when terms became too humiliating. Later, at Karkar, he contributed one of the largest chariot forces to a coalition that temporarily halted Assyrian expansion, preserving Israel's independence for another century. Modern scholars increasingly view the Ahab-Jezebel relationship as a political partnership rather than domination. Their marriage alliance opened valuable trade routes with Phoenicia and secured Israel's western flank. Within this framework, Ahab's tolerance of Baal worship appears less as weakness, calculated diplomatic policy, keeping peace with a valuable ally. The famous story of Naboth's vineyard reveals complexity in their relationship. While Jezebel orchestrates the plot, Ahab's initial response is telling. He doesn't command or threaten Naboth, but accepts his refusal and retreats, sulking. Only his wife's intervention turns desire into action. This suggests not that she controlled him, but that they operated in different spheres with complementary approaches. Jewish tradition developed a remarkably balanced view of Ahab despite his negative portrayal in Kings. The Talmud notes that despite his religious failings, he ruled during a time of prosperity, was respected internationally, and treated prophets with more patience than many supposedly righteous kings. One rabbinic passage even suggests he has a place in the world to come. His relationship with prophets reveals surprising tolerance. Unlike other kings who imprisoned or killed prophets who criticized him, Ahab maintained an open court where Elijah and Micaiah could speak freely, even when their messages condemned him. After Elijah's triumph at Mount Carmel and the slaughter of Baal's prophets, Ahab neither punishes Elijah nor prevents his escape, a restraint remarkable for ancient monarchs. Ahab's death scene provides the most poignant glimpse of his character. Warned by Micaiah that the battle will claim his life, he still leads his troops rather than sending others. When mortally wounded, he orders his charioteer to prop him up facing the battle so his troops won't lose heart. He dies at sunset, having stood bleeding for hours to preserve his army's morale, hardly the act of a weak man. Modern political analysis might view Ahab as a pragmatist caught between fundamentalist factions. Facing zealous Yahwists internally and powerful Phoenician allies externally, he attempted to balance competing interests through religious tolerance and cultural openness. Like many moderates throughout history, he satisfied neither extreme and was harshly judged by the faction that ultimately wrote the history. His son, Ahaziah, reigned just 2 years before dying in an accident. His second son, Joram, ruled for 12 relatively stable years before Jehu's revolt, suggesting Ahab established institutions stable enough to survive him. This legacy of governance contradicts the biblical portrayal of a kingdom teetering on collapse due to his religious policies. Perhaps most telling is how Ahab appears in other Near Eastern sources. Assyrian records from the Battle of Karkar describe Ahab the Israelite as a significant regional power, contributing more chariots than any other king in the coalition. These outside perspectives show a ruler commanding international respect, not a henpecked husband dominated by his wife. Marriage in ancient royal contexts functioned primarily as diplomatic alliance, not romantic union. Viewing their relationship through modern notions of marital dynamics misses the political nature of their partnership. Ahab gained Phoenician trade access and technology. Jezebel gained influence for her culture and religion. Their cooperation seems to have been genuine and effective. As biblical scholar John Van Saters notes, in many ways, Ahab appears as the most secular of Israel's kings. Perhaps this worldliness, this focus on practical governance rather than religious purity, explains why religious texts treat him harshly, while archaeological evidence suggests administrative competence. Like many leaders whose priorities centered on stability and prosperity rather than ideological purity, his legacy suffered in texts written by those with different values. The picture emerging from this reconsideration isn't of a saint wrongly maligned, but of a pragmatic ruler navigating complex political realities. Ahab's tolerance, seen as weakness by biblical writers, might instead reflect calculated governance in a diverse kingdom. His willingness to accommodate different religious practices, far from marking him as Jezebel's puppet, suggests a ruler who understood that stability sometimes requires compromise. In the final accounting, Ahab stands revealed not as the shadowy consort to a dominant queen, but as her equal partner in a political alliance that brought both benefits and consequences to ancient Israel. Their story reminds us that history's simplistic judgments often obscure the complicated reality of those who lived, loved, ruled, and died in times very different from our own. The God who didn't forget. The story begins and ends with Yahweh. Before Jezebel drew her first breath in Tyre, before Ahab ascended Israel's throne, the prophets spoke of one God who would tolerate no rivals. After her bones lay scattered in Jezreel's dust, after her name became synonymous with defiance, the same God remained, watching, remembering, shaping history with patient hands. Ancient Near Eastern religions typically tied deities to places. Baal ruled storms in Canaan, Marduk held sway in Babylon, Ashur dominated in Assyria. Gods stayed within their territories, powerful locally but limited geographically. Jezebel likely arrived in Israel with this worldview, bringing Baal not to replace Yahweh but to stand alongside him in his land. What she encountered was something different. A deity claimed to rule not just Israel but everywhere, a God who declared all other gods mere images of wood and stone. This universal claim made compromise impossible. Where polytheistic systems easily absorbed new deities, Yahwism's exclusive demands created inherent conflict with her Phoenician practices. The drought during her early years in Samaria forms a pivotal moment in this theological confrontation. For 3 years, no rain fell, a direct challenge to Baal, god of storms and fertility. When Elijah finally called fire from heaven at Mount Carmel, the issue wasn't just which deity existed, but which one controlled nature itself. The thunderstorm that followed Baal's defeat carried symbolic weight beyond mere weather. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha weren't merely court critics or social reformers. They claimed to speak directly for Yahweh. This prophetic tradition formed something unprecedented in ancient religion, individuals outside temple or palace structures who declared divine messages that often contradicted official policy. Jezebel recognized them as threats not just to her religion, but to the very concept of royal authority. The biblical narrative frames her persecution of Yahweh's prophets not as religious intolerance, but as rebellion against divine sovereignty. By silencing those voices, she wasn't merely implementing state religion, but challenging Yahweh's right to speak through chosen messengers. This direct confrontation, cutting off God's voice, escalated what might have been cultural tension into cosmic conflict. Names carry significance throughout the biblical account. Jezebel means "where is the prince" in Hebrew, possibly a deliberate wordplay suggesting "where is Baal?" Her own name becomes a theological question, one answered decisively when Baal fails to save her from Jehu's coup. Similarly, Elijah means "my God is Yahweh," making the prophet's very identity a declaration in the religious struggle. The violence marking her downfall reflected ancient understanding of divine justice. Jehu's bloodbath, killing not just Jezebel but all Ahab's descendants, wasn't viewed as political brutality but as divine cleansing. When dogs consumed her body, leaving just skull, feet, and palms, witnesses saw not random scavenging but precise fulfillment of prophecy. Every detail reinforced the message: Yahweh remembers promises and executes judgment. Later Hebrew prophets developed theological meaning from her story. Hosea, writing a century after her death, described Israel's unfaithfulness using imagery of an adulterous wife, drawing implicit comparison to Jezebel's influence. Ezekiel expanded this metaphor, describing Jerusalem as a faithless bride. These prophets transformed her legacy from political history into theological allegory about loyalty to covenant. The remarkable endurance of monotheism through subsequent centuries stands as indirect testimony to this religious struggle's significance. Had Jezebel's religious policies prevailed, had Baal worship become normalized within Israel, the development of exclusive monotheism might have faltered. Instead, the traumatic purges under Jehu and later kings reinforced boundaries between Yahwism and other faiths, setting the stage for Judaism's eventual emergence. Christian interpretation added new dimensions to this divine narrative. Jesus' criticism of religious hypocrisy echoed Elijah's confrontation with false prophets. Revelation's Jezebel symbolized internal corruption more dangerous than external persecution. The patient God who orchestrated consequences for the queen's actions became the God who works through history toward ultimate redemption. Throughout this theological drama, Yahweh displays qualities distinguishing him from other ancient deities. Unlike gods tied to natural cycles or specific locations, he operates across generations, maintaining memory of promises and threats years after humans might forget them. The decades between Elijah's prophecy and Jezebel's death demonstrate divine patience, a willingness to work within human timeframes while transcending them. Jewish mystical tradition found deeper meaning in her story. Kabbalistic interpretations saw Jezebel as representing kelipot, shells or husks that conceal divine light. Her destruction became symbolic of breaking barriers that separate humanity from God. Even in her villainy, she served divine purpose, showing how opposition ultimately clarifies rather than defeats spiritual truth. The religious landscape Jezebel entered had already been shaped by centuries of tension between exclusive Yahwism and more syncretistic practices. Archaeological evidence shows household shrines with female figurines throughout Israelite settlements, suggesting many ordinary people maintained older Canaanite practices alongside Yahweh worship. Her policies didn't introduce foreign elements, but elevated existing undercurrents to official status. This God who didn't forget Jezebel hasn't forgotten her today. Her story continues shaping religious understanding of fidelity, compromise, and consequences. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, though differing in many beliefs, share commitment to monotheism, partly forged in the crucible of conflicts like those she represents. The theological boundaries she challenged have defined religious identity for billions across 3 millennia. Perhaps most profound is how her story illustrates divine sovereignty working through human freedom. Neither Jezebel nor Elijah nor Jehu knew they enacted a drama extending far beyond 9th century BC politics. Each made choices for immediate reasons: power, survival, ambition, faith, yet together wove a pattern visible only from historical distance. The biblical writers saw in this pattern not random events, but divine orchestration. For believers today, the God who remembered promises to Israel still remembers promises to them. For skeptics, the story illustrates how powerful narratives shape history regardless of their metaphysical truth. Either way, the confrontation between queen and prophet, between royal decree and divine command, between immediate political reality and eternal moral claim continues echoing through history, a testament to how past conflicts shape present identities. The queen who wouldn't bow her final moment tells us everything. As Jehu's chariot thundered toward the palace, servants fled and guards disappeared. Jezebel faced a choice: hide, disguise herself, beg for mercy. She chose none of these. Instead, she painted her eyes with kohl, arranged her hair, and placed herself at the window above the gate. Her last act wasn't surrender but defiance, a queen to the bitter end. This gesture, applying makeup before death, has been tragically misunderstood. Critics called it vanity, as if she primped to seduce her killer. The truth runs deeper. In ancient Near Eastern courts, royal appearance was political statement. By donning full queenly regalia, she faced death not as a frightened woman, but as Tyre's princess and Israel's queen. She died as she had lived, unbowed, unbroken, unwilling to concede her identity or authority. Her final words ring with bitter sarcasm. Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master? By invoking Zimri, a military commander who murdered his king but lasted only 7 days on the throne, she simultaneously acknowledges Jehu's coup and prophesies its ultimate failure. Even at the threshold of death, she speaks not as victim, but as royal voice pronouncing judgment on a pretender. That final confrontation distills themes running throughout her life. Born to rule in Phoenicia, she never accepted relegation to ceremonial status in Israel. While biblical authors condemned her independence, it reflected her upbringing in Tyre's cosmopolitan court, where royal women wielded genuine power. What Israel saw as transgression, she understood as birthright. Throughout her story runs a thread often overlooked: consistency. Unlike kings who shifted policies with political winds, Jezebel remained steadfast in her cultural and religious identity. From the moment she crossed into Israel until her body fell beneath the window, she maintained her Phoenician practices and beliefs. This constancy, condemned as stubbornness by enemies, reveals integrity rare among ancient rulers. Consider what she faced: a foreign land hostile to her customs, prophets declaring her gods false, constant pressure to abandon her identity. Lesser figures might have compromised for safety or popularity. Jezebel refused. Whether from religious conviction, cultural pride, or political strategy, she maintained course despite mounting opposition, a steadiness that commands reluctant respect even from critics. Her methods provoke more complicated assessment: the persecution of Yahweh's prophets, the judicial murder of Naboth, the aggressive promotion of Baal worship. These actions cannot be simply excused as cultural differences, yet they must be understood within their context. Ancient monarchies didn't operate on democratic principles or religious freedom. Every Near Eastern kingdom enforced state religion through mechanisms we would now consider oppressive. What made Jezebel exceptional wasn't her methods, but her situation: a Phoenician princess promoting Phoenician practices in Israelite territory. Had she enforced Yahwism in Phoenicia, history might remember her as a righteous missionary queen. Had she merely practiced Baal worship privately without public promotion, she might appear as a tolerable foreign consort. The unforgivable offense was her refusal to assimilate, her insistence that her gods and customs deserved equal standing in her adopted homeland. Modern women in leadership still face echoes of her situation. Those who refuse to soften their approach or modify their speech to match gender expectations often find themselves labeled with terms carrying Jezebel's legacy: manipulative, scheming, unnatural. The powerful woman who maintains course despite criticism continues triggering deep cultural anxieties about female authority. Despite centuries of vilification, admiration for her courage threads through alternative readings of her story. Jewish feminist theologian Tikva Frymer-Kensky notes that while biblical authors condemned her actions, they never portrayed her as weak, fearful, or inconstant. Christian feminist scholars like Tina Pippin observe that unlike many biblical women recorded only in relation to men, Jezebel maintains distinct identity and agency throughout her narrative. Even her enemies granted her significance. Her consistent portrayal as beautiful deserves examination. Ancient texts rarely mention female appearance unless it serves narrative purpose. Jezebel's beauty becomes shorthand for foreign allure, the dangerous attractiveness of practices differing from established tradition. Like Helen launching 1,000 ships, Jezebel's beauty functions symbolically, representing seductive power of cultural alternatives to exclusive Yahwism. Was she evil or principled, villain or victim, oppressor or merely different? These questions miss something essential about her complexity. Like most compelling historical figures, she defies simple categories: a princess raised to honor certain gods, a queen determined to maintain her identity, a woman wielding power in ways her society deemed inappropriate. She contains multitudes beyond morality tales. Perhaps most remarkable is how thoroughly she integrated her convictions with action. Whether promoting Baal worship, confronting prophets, or facing death with dignity, Jezebel demonstrated rare alignment between belief and behavior. While biblical authors condemn the content of her convictions, the strength with which she held them commands attention across millennia. In the final accounting, Jezebel stands as testament to the cost of defiance. Her story isn't primarily about wickedness punished, but about boundaries enforced, religious, cultural, gender boundaries that her existence challenged. The gruesome details of her death, the dogs consuming her flesh, the erasure of her burial place, these serve as warnings about crossing lines society deems sacred. Yet she persists, refusing historical erasure just as she refused submission in life. Despite efforts to reduce her to cautionary tale or theological object lesson, she emerges from ancient texts as remarkably human. Ambitious, devoted to her gods, protective of her interests, unwilling to fade quietly into foreign customs. The woman who wouldn't bow in life refuses to lie flat in history. What remains when we strip away layers of interpretation? A Phoenician princess maintaining her identity in hostile territory. A queen exercising power according to her understanding of monarchy. A priestess honoring gods she was raised to worship. A woman facing death with composed dignity. These elements persist regardless of moral judgment about her actions. Her painted eyes still watch us across 3,000 years, challenging easy assumptions about power, gender, cultural assimilation, and religious exclusivity. The queen who wouldn't bow continues asking uncomfortable questions about how societies respond to difference and how history treats those who defy prevailing norms. In her unflinching gaze lies her final victory. She remains unforgettable even in defeat.